Welcome to the official podcast of FOR ETERNIA.com. We have the power. I'm your host, AJ, aka Voodoo Magic, aka Zor, and today's episode is titled Reborn, a title inspired by the 2021 animated series Masters of the Universe Revelation Powerhouse Animation Model Sheet, Orco Reborn, that represents the show's metamorphosis of Orko. But also, it is a title that perfectly encapsulates this new age of MOTU, where today, January 25th, the next chapter, the next animated series installment of titled Masters of the Universe Revolution has dropped on Netflix. And who better to discuss all of this, the metamorphosis of Orko and the brand, followed by a juicy, spoiler discussion of Masters of the Universe Revolution. And don't worry, we will warn you when we get there. Then with the talented star of both stage and screen, fantastic podcast host, and the man who plays the Trollin Wizard himself, Griffin Newman. Griffin,
Hello.
It's such an honor. Thank you so much for coming on.
No, I'm so glad we can make this happen. You messaged me many months ago, and I'm very bad at checking messages. But what I thought I had responded at the time was, let's put a pin in it and talk when the new seasons come out. So there's something juicy to talk about. And then I went to message you what in my mind I thought was following up and realized, no, this is my first response. But I'm glad we made it happen.
Yeah, me too. And so before we started recording, I was telling Griffin that, I had this splitting sinus headache, which I'll apologize in advance if I sound more incoherent than usual. But I said I was going to lean on him, and I'm not worried because this gentleman is a pro. And he has a long-running podcast called Blank Check. How long has that been running, Griffin?
In March, it will be 9 years. Yeah. Yeah.
So this guy is an expert, and I'm going to lean on him. And
I mean, I don't know if anyone's an expert in podcasting. It's weird when there's a medium that's so young still, relatively, that the people I think of as experts are the people who've been doing it for 15 years, which is basically as long as anyone's been doing it. And even those people will tell you to some degree we're all scrambling in the dark.
Do you know who the pioneer was? I would love to know that. Like
who the first person? That's a good question. There's the wave of people I look to who I'm like, they were in sort of 2005, 2006, which is when it was really starting to kick off. But I don't know who like the first was. When my co-host David Sims and I got into doing our show, we thought fully that we were too late. We were like 2015. The trend has peaked. We're getting in too late. We might be able to grab some table scraps, but this whole thing is probably on its way out. We were very wrong.
You know what? I still think it is a growing medium. It's definitely a lot crowded now, and I'm sure every week there's just new podcasts popping up. But seems like a large percentage of them don't stick with it, and
I think that's the big thing. I mean, the thing that I love about podcasting as a medium is that it is, I feel like it's much more democratic than any other art form we've had, because its creation was tied to basically everyone having access to the exact same tools to make stuff. You can have a nicer microphone, or you can have a sound studio with insulation or whatever, but basically anyone with any device could make some version of a podcast, and for $100 a year, upload it somewhere, have it live at the absolute least. So what's nice about that is there is no bar for entry. You're not begging old companies to give you money and access and permission to do something. And what's tough about it is that anyone can do it, which means it's that much harder to get anyone to pay attention to the thing that you're doing.
Yeah.
But yeah, we for several years, there was a very small number of people who were listening to us, and we just kind of stuck with it because we like doing it. And the fact that it's we're still doing it almost a decade later is very surprising.
That's great.
Yeah.
I was actually listening the other day, and I believe you guys were talking director David Fincher and the movie The Social Network. And I was so impressed. You know, my brain isn't like wired as sharp and snappy as you guys. And you guys were just like rapid fire with the movie references and the trivia. And you guys must be awesome at that game, 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon.
Pretty good at it. Yeah.
Yeah, I bet.
But I'll say, I mean, it is truly, this is the only area in which my brain is wired that sharply. You color outside to almost any other subject and I know nothing. And my recall is really slow. This is just kind of all the stuff that's on the surface. Movies and MOTU and action figures. And like, there's my series of interests, which I go very deep on and have quick recall on. And then if you showed me a map of the United States, I would really embarrass myself on a quick quiz.
Well, yeah, you were, I think you said somewhere you were like really good at trivia, right? Or you would like
our podcast came out of David and I went to a movie trivia night, a bar that sadly is shut down since in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and we sort of became friends through going to that and getting very, very competitive about it. And we very quickly went from being kind of the underdogs who people were rooting for. That's sweet that they show up and they try their hardest to win, to being like the bullies, like the Camp Mohawk that everyone hated. So we stopped going. And it was a really high level trivia night that was mostly film critics and people who worked on film crews and film students. And a lot of the people who are guests on our podcast now are people we first met from that trivia night. But when we stopped going, we realized that we had stopped hanging out, that was our structure, was every Tuesday we would hang out with each other. And we kind of missed each other as friends. So we said, like, what's a new way? We need some activity to form our friendship around. So the podcasting really started as an excuse for us to get together and just talk and have a set plan to do that once a week. And then over time, it turned into more of a job.
Well,
yeah.
I imagine your audience has grown tremendously. So, and I don't know. For me, you don't want me on movie trivia night. You know, I think I forget more than I remember generally in life. You know.
Do you feel like you could do like a MOTU specific trivia though? Because I feel like there are people who, even if they have the knowledge, the structure of trivia as a game, the pressure of it, their brain doesn't operate well in that situation.
Yeah, I think I have trouble with names. You know,
okay.
Like if I start calling you Kevin Smith today,
you could do that. Yeah, yeah. I left my jersey at home, but you can do that. But like, do you think? I mean, if I were to start pointing at the figures behind you on the shelf, do you feel like it would take a moment to recall one?
Probably not.
Yeah, right. This is my question. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe if it was in this little fixed little niche, but yeah. I don't know. Maybe I'll have to give it a try one time. But you're definitely not going to want to pick me last.
Sure. I'm trying to, because StreamYard, it's a smaller box.
Yeah.
But is everything behind you? This is Classics and Masterverse, right?
Yeah.
And do you have Origins there as well? Or is that a separate?
I don't think in that view you can see Origins, but there is some classics, the Filmation classics figures I love, the Club Grayskull figure.
Yes, yeah.
And so if you're looking in that center row, I guess right here.
Right, those are like the Filmation ones, and then
there's a classics Granomir, but then some Masterverse like He-Man and Tila and Prince Adam.
I just feel like it is an interesting thing, and I'm always curious to see. I've watched your channel for a while, and I watch so many other MOTU YouTubers. And when I'm scanning people's collections, it's interesting to see who mixes Classics and Masterverse, because they are pretty,
Yeah, they're pretty interchangeable. They pose pretty well together.
Yeah, and the articulation structure is a little bit different, but by and large, it's like the size is just about the same, and it feels like you have them separated by shelves, but the shelves are so close to each other that it does feel like they're all unified.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, have you picked up your Masterverse Orko figures? There he is. Yeah, I got that one too. I actually did an unboxing and review. For anyone who's listening, that's Orko Reborn.
Yes.
I guess it's just called Orko, but it's really Orko Reborn.
Well, this is, I mean, you were saying this in the introduction, and it's fascinating to me because, as you said, Orko Reborn was the title that Powerhouse put it on it for like the character design turnaround. And I feel like on working on the show, we always kind of informally called him Orko the White, but that's sort of just a Gandalf joke.
Yeah.
And then what's the other one? There's another term that we use sometimes when we refer to him. But I feel like, and I imagine you're maybe the same way, you know, all these names are sort of casual and colloquial until it's put onto action figure packaging. And then you're like, well, now that's solidified as that's the official term. And in the new Masterverse set with Gildor, I think he's just listed as Orko. They don't give him a subtitle. So I think it's still up for debate what the official name is for the new post-death Orko.
You know, Masterverse has this issue, and I've raised it before, where they have like 8 or 9 Skeletors, and even though it's like different type of version, like a Horde Skeletor,
right,
from Masters of the Universe Revelation, the nickname is Horde Skeletor,
but on the box it just says Skeletor, right?
On the box it just says Skeletor, and
right. The only sort of titling I feel like they do otherwise is whatever the general branding is of, is it New Eternia, is it Revelation? But I don't know. I like classics would do that, where it's like the variation was part of the proper name of the figure.
Yeah. I mean, I wanted Skeletech to be Skeletech, and that just
right. That one's too wow. Yeah.
And I never understood it. Maybe, you know, I actually, like a big geek, I messaged the product manager, Roy, and asked him, but I didn't get an answer. And maybe he didn't have an official answer to provide me. But, you know, I thought maybe it was a marketing thing, like Skeletor is that name. And if they named it like Skeletech, people wouldn't understand it if they're doing their orders, you know, retailers and stuff like that.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's just, but you know, it's like, this is the 9th Skeletor.
Yeah.
Which Skeletor are you referring to? You know?
Right.
Hey, but you know what? Let's get into that. Little lovable Trollin wizard. So before we get into your contribution of the role, so what was your exposure, Griffin, to Masters of the Universe when you're younger? You know, I understand you did have some exposure. You were a fan, but was it the brand's toys, the cartoon?
I got in through. So I'm like a late 80s baby, rather, not late 90s. I'm young, but I'm not that young. So I was a little too young to miss the original. I was a little too young to experience the original wave of MOTU at its peak. I was sort of growing up as it was winding down. And then I was a big like comic book store kid and a really big action figure collector. And I obsessively read Toy Fair magazine. And Toy Fair would always talk about MOTU. And this is sort of late 90s at this point. Early 2000s, the other brands that they would talk about were all still kind of on shelves, you know, even though there had been new iterations. It's like, well, they're talking about G1 Transformers, but Transformers is still around. They're talking about, you know, Valor versus Venom G.I. Joe, or Real American Hero G.I. Joe, but Valor versus Venom is still on shelves, you know?
Right.
All the other brands had sort of continued iterating, Ninja Turtles, obviously like Marvel and DC, and MOTU had just kind of disappeared in that period. So I was really fascinated by like, what is this thing that is talked about in Toy Fair with so much reverence, that was clearly so big generationally, that I missed by like a couple years, that now seems to just be gone. And right around that time, I was at summer camp and I met a guy, an older kid named Grunge, who was like my idol. And I swear to God, his 2 biggest obsessions were MOTU and Kevin Smith. He was obsessed with those 2 things. I think it probably...
Was that his birth name, Grunge?
No, but his birth name was a closely guarded government secret. But he would dress like Silent Bob in the middle of the summer. I mean, he wore the big trench coat and the backwards hat and everything, and was obsessed with MOTU and made some reference to Prince Adam at some point. And I went, "Do you know about this? What is this thing?" And he started explaining it to me as a kid who was like 5 years older than me and had been able to live through the height of it. And right around that time, they started doing I guess it would have been, was it for the 15th anniversary or the 20th anniversary? Do you remember when Mattel did, like 2001, they did a series of reissues of the original figures?
Yeah.
They put them back in stores in like super commemorative fancy packaging.
Right before the classics, yeah.
Well, it was right before the 2000X series.
That too, yep.
It was right before they announced that. So that's when I got in. It was like suddenly the old figures are back on shelves. Then the 2000X series starts with the Four Horsemen figures, that line. And when that line hit, they had both the deluxe figures and then certain retailer exclusives. It would come with a VHS of the Filmation series. There were like 10 volumes of the Filmation series, like one episode per VHS as a bonus with figure. So I was almost a completist on that, the Four Horsemen 2000X line, and then was collecting these VHSs in the time before the DVD sets actually came out. So that's really like when I got hardcore into it. I have remained a fan since then through classics and everything.
You know, this guy Grunge, I mean, in a way, he's prolific. Kevin Smith, Masters of the Universe.
It's insane. It's insane.
Do you still talk to him?
I haven't talked to him in a bit. I did keep in touch with him for a while. I would run into him at like Comic-Cons and stuff. I mean, he lives in Canada. But I do think about how bizarre that is, that when I heard, hey, they're doing a new MOTU series and Kevin Smith is the showrunner, I did think, like, did Grunge will this into existence? Was this like a Zoltar machine wish that he made come true? I was not expecting those two names to ever come together outside of a Grunge sentence.
Yeah, they really didn't feel like they would ever mesh in my
No. Yeah.
You know, so you got those Filmation episodes. So you became the Filmation series after you started watching those episodes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I watched those a lot. And then the 2000X, the Mike Young production show, started right after that. I watched that obsessively. And then maybe a year or two after that, I think those season DVD sets came out. So I was getting into the 2000X stuff at the same time as I was going back into the classic Filmation and the vintage figures and everything. But I was just in high school, the wrong age to be incredibly into both 80s and 2000s MOTU, you know?
Yeah.
I was sort of like stuck between a couple spots, but really, really deeply into it.
You know, I had a friend who was really into it as well, but he was like ahead of his time. He was like in his, age 12, age 13, he would keep it pristine. Like,
smart.
Friends would come over and be like, to grab to play with it. He'd be like, don't touch it. Don't touch it. And he was ahead of his time. You know, everyone thought he was like wacko, like what's with him? He won't share his toys. But it was all about, keeping them perfect. And who knew that he was so smart?
I know. It's I mean, you were asking if I have my own Masterverse figures. I have too many Masterverse figures in general, but certainly I have multiples of the first Orko figure. This one, the Orko Reborn, I finally just got my hands on one, but I'm looking to get more soon. But I've already had a big MOTU collection, and it's certainly gotten bigger over the last couple of years. But I got the part a couple months before the pandemic started. So I think like a lot of people whose collections got out of control during the pandemic, where you're suddenly stuck at home with more time to browse eBay.
Yeah.
And less activities to take your attention away. I got, obsessive about I want to have everything Orco, right? Because at this point, it's like now it's a business expense. It's a serious business expense for character research.
Well, I imagine in animation cells too, right? You know?
Yeah, well, that's a slippery slope because there's so
Yeah.
many of them out there that I do have quite a few, but it's like you can't try to pick up every single one that circulates.
But
But
that's what makes them so affordable is there were so
yes,
many episodes,
yes,
130 episodes that you go for like a Bugs Bunny animation cell or,
yeah,
something else that was just a Saturday cartoon with like a limited amount of episodes and the price is so expensive. But
yes. The MOTU
MOTU,
ones, they're plentiful. Yeah.
yeah,
Um,
I mean, they've
no, I,
gone up
I,
there, but
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, there's so much MOTU merch that has Orko on it, like group shot things, things that have multiple characters on the side of a backpack or whatever. And I try to limit myself to like, what are the Orko specific items?
mhm.
And part of the game there is figuring out, oh, in Brazil they made chapstick of the different characters. Was there an Orko version, or did they stop at Man at Arms? All those sorts of things. But when I track down some of these items, it's like astonishing when you can find them mint in package. And even like you talking about your friend growing up who had the foresight to try to keep things pristine, right, and in
Mhm.
good condition. Some of these things you're like, how did this survive for 40 years? Not even like unopened, but even if this was just unsold stock in the back room of a store,
Mm.
I don't care that much about having pristine packaging. I prefer to just have the thing. But sometimes you find something and you go like, it's just wild that this actually survived in this condition for this long, untouched.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's all foresight or some of that is like it went into a box. It's supposed to be
Yeah,
a birthday
I think
present,
I,
and
I think a lot of it is like I think a lot of the stuff that exists in the best condition is stuff that was truly neglected,
mm,
that was unsold, that was like lost, packed away somewhere.
because especially back then there
Yeah.
wasn't that collector mindset. Yes, I had
No.
a friend with the foresight, but most
Right.
people didn't treat collectibles that way. Like I have this is gonna show how geek I am. Somewhere down here, I have you remember Masters of the Universe Revelation, the cereal boxes, Eternia Crunch,
Oh
and
yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I
Yeah. Yeah.
think FYE solo.
Yes.
So I
Yeah.
so I have two boxes with the
Yeah.
cereal
Same.
still inside,
Same.
wrapped
Yeah.
in plastic,
Yes.
and but to find something back from the 80s like
Yeah.
that is just unheard of
Well,
because
that's the stuff, right? Like the food items. I mean, I understand there was a small percentage of people who had the foresight of like maybe action figures will go up in value,
mhm.
a couple decades time. But when you see like a nightlight that is still like mint on card, you're like, I don't think anyone could have anticipated the nightlight market. But maybe I'm wrong. And like the nightlight seems to be the rarest Orco thing out there. It is like never up for sale. I forget which country it's from, but there's like an Orco nightlight nightlight. Orco Nightlife is a spin-off show. There's an Orco nightlight that I cannot find for the life of me. And occasionally I'll see an image up there of like, oh, one sold on eBay 10 years ago, and there's still somewhere like the remnant of the listing,
Mm.
mint on card. And it's fascinating to think like, was that just some old drugstore that like it fell behind the rack and just stayed there, preserved, like mummified?
It might have. I've heard
Yeah.
stories of that. People in warehouses open a box and it's like
Yeah.
mint in card, like Kenner Star Wars figures from 1980 or 79 or whatever that was.
Yeah.
But well, 77, right? But the figures came out
Wouldn't come
78.
out till 78. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. All right, so let's rewind then and
Yes,
talk
please.
about you
Yeah.
getting that role of Orko in the Masters of the Universe Revelation series because I heard bits and pieces
Mhm.
of this and it's pretty wild, especially with you being a fan. Meaning there's not many stories out there where someone is wanting a role, chasing a role, lobbying for the role, and actually successfully gets it. It always seems like
Yeah.
the opposite happens, especially when you're a fan. So
Yes.
it's like you really defied gravity here.
A little bit, yeah. I do think sometimes. I mean, it's funny. I was on a TV show called The Tick for Amazon that was an adaptation of the comic book and then the Fox cartoon show and then the Patrick Warburton Fox show.
You were Arthur.
I was Arthur, which was insane. It was similarly a character I've loved for a long time and a property I've loved for a long time that I really wanted to play. But that was, kind of an entirely traditional thing where my agent send me an email and say, hey, there's an opportunity to audition for the role of Arthur. Do you want to make a tape and send it in to them? And I, the whole time, thought it was very unlikely that I was going to get that part as badly as I wanted it. And I worked very hard to try to convince them to hire me, which did somehow ultimately work. But I was not campaigning for that publicly. I did not know that the show was coming back until I got that audition, at which point there was a sort of official channel. This is the proper way for me to make my case for playing this part, go through these auditions and these meetings and these tapes and all of that. And I just did not let most people in my life even know that I was in contention for it until it got announced, because I didn't want to jinx it. The Orco thing was, as you're sort of saying, the opposite, where I was very vocal out loud very early on that I wanted to do this, long before there was any official pipeline to even sort of make my stand, do my proper audition for it. There's a writer on the show, I believe he also wrote on season 2, named Eric Carrasco, who is a good friend of my oldest friend. My oldest friend's a guy named Derek Simon, who wrote for Supergirl and has written for a bunch of other things, but wrote on the entirety of the CW Supergirl. And we were summer camp buddies. He was the only other guy I knew who was still collecting action figures, as we were both in those transitional ages where you're starting to see everyone else fall out of it. And it's like, oh, you also have a Toy Fair subscription? You're also like pot committed to this for the rest of your life? Yeah. So we were two nerds who would run, I would say, almost this minor con of forgetting to pack our bathing suit every day so they couldn't make us go in the swimming pool. So then we would sit on the side in the dirt next to the swimming pool and trade X-Men cards. And we would like doodle our dream action figure lines. We were both obsessed with like, okay, what would be in series 1 and what would be in series 2 and what are the variants and how would you draw it? What would the articulation cuts be? I mean, just like deep, deep dorks. Yeah. And so like 10, 20 years later, we find ourselves, he's writing for Supergirl and I'm on the Tick, and we're both sort of doing the real version of what we used to fantasize about as kids. Eric Carrasco works on Supergirl with him. And I'm catching up with Derek, and he says, by the way, you want to hear something crazy? Do you know what Eric just got hired to write on? The new Masters of the Universe show. And I went, there's a new MOTU show? And he went, yeah, Kevin Smith's the showrunner. And that's when I go, like, this is some sort of weird psyop to blow Grunge's mind. But I went, oh, that's insane. I want to play Orko so badly. I immediately said, I want to play Orko so badly. And he went, well, you know what? I should tell Eric to like call you, because I know he's nervous about, trying to understand. Eric's like, first and foremost, I think a really big DC Comics guy. Okay. And he's written a couple of the DC animated movies. He wrote for Justice League Action. He wrote on Supergirl. And MOTU, he's a fan.
He's a big Lord of the Rings guy too, I think.
Big Lord of the Rings guy. Has been working on a show with Zack Snyder. Has an incredible resume. Yeah. But I think because he is such a big fan of so many things, he knew MOTU is not my number one thing. I like this, but I kind of want to understand before I start writing for it, what are like the most extreme opinions in this sphere, which you can never fully prepare yourself for. But Derek gives him the heads up. He goes, Griffin's actually really into MOTU if you're looking to talk to somebody before you start writing the show. So he calls me, and we just have a conversation where I just tell him what I like about it, Mm-hmm. And sort of as someone who was on the HE-MAN.org message boards, RIP, back in the day for a very long time, and all these sorts of things, it was just sort of like, where does the fandom stand on the live action movie? Is that something that they ignore? Is that something that they like? Is that something people would want to see worked into the canon? He's just a writer on the show, but he's kind of trying to do his homework on understanding the way the fandom operates. And so we just have this conversation that's me just sort of giving him my, it's not like I'm pitching him things for the show, but it's just sort of me telling him my perspective on things. And then he goes, and what's your opinion on Orko? And I go, look, I love Orko. Orko's like a little divisive because I think depending on what age you were when you got into it, Orko's the character that children largely see the show through if you're watching it at the right age, because he's the little guy who's joining the adventures, but he's kind of the little brother to everyone. He's trying his hardest, but he's messing up, And then I think, if you were a little bit older when you got into MOTU, some people have the relationship of he's the annoying one. He's getting in the way of all the serious action. It's all this comic hijinks and whatever. And he's just the type of character I've always loved and the type of comic relief I've always loved, even though I was getting into the shows when I'm like 12 or 13. So I was just making my case for why I love Orko so much. And he went like, is Orko something you'd want to play? And I was like, yes, obviously. I didn't have the courage to say this to you. And he was like, well, look, we haven't started the writer's room, but I was just like, I've been watching the show, prepping for everything, and I just kept thinking, like, you could probably do this. And I was like, well, yes, obviously, this is my dream role. I would like to do this. So there was that sort of heads up I had of knowing the show was happening, knowing I had at least one other person working on the show who was aligned with me. And I just kind of like stayed on the thing like a hawk. I messaged my manager, my agents, and I just said, like, look, they're not casting yet. This thing hasn't even formally been announced yet. I really want to play this part. This is the part I want to play. I feel really strongly about this. And then I just kind of stayed in communication. I found out another friend I had, Dimitra, who worked on the Tick, also ended up getting hired as a writer on the show.
Yeah.
And so I just kind of stayed abreast of it, but I also became very aware that they were really looking to build this all-star cast that they ended up getting for the show. And I think when the cast was first announced, Netflix put out an image of the full cast list and characters.
It was some calligraphy and
yeah, like it was a cracked open book. And a lot of people went like, oh, they're going to spend so much money on this cast. Why aren't they saving the money to put it up on screen? Why wouldn't they spend this money on the animation? We don't care who the famous people are. And what I think people need to understand is every single cast member of this show was paid scale, which is the union minimum you can be paid for any project, right? And scale works relative to scale for a big budget movie or scale for an animated series or whatever it is. But it was more that there was an overabundance of people who wanted to be part of this project that led to them getting their real pick of the litter for every role and a lot of big names. But it certainly wasn't a case of Netflix, I think, aggressively seeking out or overspending to try to get flashy names for the show.
I knew a lot of them were fans.
That's the thing. People wanted to do it. Yes. Yeah. So I was aware that I was going to be facing stiff competition no matter what for the role. I had one good friend who got an email for the audition and said to me, I'm not going in for it because I know this is the part you want. I got so hyperfixated on, I think a lot of it was for me that I always loved Orko so much and I loved kind of the spirit of him. I think if Orko were someone who was confidently going into battle and then messing up spells, I would find him annoying in the way that some people do. But the core of Orko that I always loved was that he was operating from such a good place. He always so badly wanted to help and help his friends who he cared about so deeply. And every single time he would fail, basically. But he was undeterred. He never stopped trying. And I love characters like that continue to sort of like push uphill in the face of overwhelming odds. It's a thing I really loved about Arthur on the Tick is that character is so terrified, so anxious, so in over his head in every battle, but yet he shows up and he does it. He's not strong. He's not super powered. he's not confident, but he like does it. And I just felt, having done the tick already, I think I have a take on how I could do Orco that really brings that to the forefront, and would love to try to make an Orco who's a little bit more, not emotional as in sad, but like emotionally rounded, where some of the subtext becomes text. And I'd love that challenge to try to make an Orco that could win people over. And so, yeah, I just like tweeted about it a lot. Whenever I was doing interviews for the tick, I would talk about how badly I want to play this character. I just kept on trying to sort of like seed it out there in the world until I finally got the email audition. And I did a tape that was me playing every character. There's a recording I have that's still me doing Evil Lyn and He-Man and Orko. Not because I was auditioning for those other parts, but because I went, what's easier if I'm playing off the other dialogue, even though my Evil Lyn impression was terrible, my He-Man impression was terrible.
That doesn't throw you off, though, if you're
on
both sides?
It did a little bit, but then I found it's weird. I mean, with voiceover, we can get into all of this more. I know this is a very long, rambling answer, but it's funny how different times, different techniques help you, you know? Yeah. And to be honest, I actually did about 4 or 5 different approaches. So, you know, I had a couple of takes of I'm playing every character. And I had a couple of takes of I did the Orco dialogue in my natural speaking voice, and then I ran it through an app and pitched it up and made it sound a little bit more like the Filmation voice.
Oh,
and
so
then I did
tried
a couple
modulation. Like
I tried everything.
Okay.
I tried everything because I said, I don't know what they're looking for. I don't know how much they want to do this in post. You know, do they want someone who can sound like Orco, or do they want someone who is giving line readings and then they'll make them sound like Orco in post? Because the 2000X series and the Filmation series, both, it was a post effect. You had someone playing the character emotionally, you know, and putting feeling into the line readings, but the voice as we know it was entirely done in editing, and had that sort of auto-tuned effect, right? And I didn't know which they would want, so I tried it every way, and I said, is it better if I'm doing the lines? I so badly wanted to do this that the thing that's often scary about auditioning, especially when you're recording something yourself and sending it in rather than meeting with someone in person, is you often only get one bite at the apple. And back in the days pre-pandemic, when you would go into physical rooms to audition with other people, you would try something and then people would go, I see what you're doing, but that's actually not quite right. Can you try it this way instead? And then they get to see you do the version they want and see if you took direction well and all of that. With self-taping, as they call it, you basically get one shot. And if you picked the wrong road to go down, even if you executed it well, they'll go, well, that's not the right thing. So I said, let me do every single version of this possible, and then send them sort of the options of, here's the menagerie of what I could possibly do with this. And then I sent it in. I didn't hear anything for maybe a week or two. I assumed, I guess this is not happening and I should move on. And then I got the email that I'd gotten the role on Halloween of 2019. I think I started recording it January 2020. They announced the cast February. It was Valentine's Day was when that post came out.
So that's how you're notified via email? I mean, you know, I'm always thinking you find out like in a cool way, you know, versus just getting through an email or even through an agent or a casting agent. You know, maybe I'm just romanticizing the process.
Yeah.
But I'm imagining a call from Kevin Smith or Ted Biaselli and saying,
it depends. I've gotten those calls as well. Okay. This was one where it was a moving train. So it was basically one email that had a lot of people CC'd on it that just said, Griffin, excellent news. You have been offered the role of Orko. Wow. Which of these times are available for you to record? It was like, you know, I'm finding out about it on a Friday and I'm scheduling for the following Monday or Tuesday to do it. And it
print frame.
Yeah. But there was less of the sort of pomp and circumstance excitement because I think it was a little like down to brass tacks. This thing has to go. And from that moment I'm activated, I don't even know how they want me to do it, of all the different takes I sent in, you know? I go,
You
well,
just know they want you to do it.
they've chosen to give me the part, which I'm very, like, I'm thrilled about, but I don't even know what they want. So I'm that whole weekend practicing all the different versions of it. Yeah. Until I get in there.
You know, you were talking about the character and the love and hate, right, that people feel towards Orko. And for me, I was, remember when, sure you do, when Kevin Smith was saying, I'm going to make sure all you kids get tattoos.
Yeah.
Of, you're going to love Orko so much. He's going to be so metal. You're going to want a tattoo. And I actually became one of those people that became a Orko fan later in life because of Masters Universe Revelation. And I'll explain. So in Masters of the Universe Revelation, as you know, being a Filmation fan, there were some creative liberties taken with the Orko character. While it was promoted, it was highlighted that the series was a spiritual sequel to the classic 1983 Filmation series, He-Man and Masters of the Universe. And I believe it was during a live stream with Toy Galaxy, and Ted Biaselli, executive producer Ted Biaselli, talked about how the show pretty much honored all the events, or Masters of the Universe Revelation honored all the events of the classic TV show, less 3 creative liberties taken. And one of those creative liberties was Orko. And they were stuck on this idea, why in the world would Orko leave Trala for Eternia?
Right.
When on Trala, he was a powerful wizard.
Or so he always would claim. Yeah.
Well, I think he was because, well, look, he had a girlfriend, right?
Yes, he did. He was certainly powerful in that one area, if nothing else.
And he was certainly, he had a lot of fans, if I remember, and, had this great reputation about him. And so why would Orko leave his family, leave his friends, leave his girlfriend just to become, this court jester of mockery? And it was better to have an Orko inept on his home planet as well, trying to win the approval of his parents and live up to that Oracle name, which is a source of bonding with Prince Adam, who was also struggling for approval from his parents, or at least his father, right, King Randall.
Well, and also I think the biggest thing that, and you've now gotten to watch all the Revolution episodes, not to cut you off, but I think the biggest thematic force behind both of these seasons is it's a show about legacies, right? And it's a show about characters that have legacies placed upon them and the pressures of those legacies. So, Teela and the Sorceress, and Adam with the notion of becoming king someday. The villain, one of the main villains of Revolution, who I won't say because it's a bit of a spoiler.
But Orko, in that section yet.
Yeah. Right, but Orko fits in thematically in the same way of someone who these great expectations were placed upon and perhaps struggled to live up to them. Yeah.
Well, so as a kid, in the cartoon, Orko just got in the way of me spending more time with He-Man, as you were saying.
I think that's how many people felt. Yeah.
But then as an adult, I could never find the character relatable before. It's like I was saying, okay, you got this girlfriend, you're a master wizard at home, everyone looks up to you, but here in Eternia, everyone laughs at your ineptness, and I should feel bad for you for that. So it wasn't until Revelation course corrected that character, and we had this like beautiful moment in Trala with Lynn, where Orko was supposed to be the Oracle, but couldn't do anything right, is when I finally, after, what was that, 39 years? Connected with the little bugger and then loved him. So it really was. I mean, Kevin Smith was trying to execute this plan. And for me, that came true. Or suddenly I was always just sort of, down on Orko. I mean, I didn't hate him, but I didn't love him. But now I love him because I could relate to him finally.
I mean, I appreciate everything you said. I agree with it strongly. I know most of what you're saying, the credit goes to Kevin and the writers. But that was my abstract goal and why I want to play the character so badly, is I like that kind of challenge as an actor. I like to try to get the audience on board with a character, to lower their defenses and make them care for a character they maybe thought they could never care for. I think that's an interesting sort of challenge to do as an actor. And so I may be attracted to characters that on their face kind of present that sort of difficulty.
You did a great job too.
Thank you. But I had that sort of abstract goal, and then I got the part. As I said, I got this email, and attached to the email were the scripts, and I devoured them, and I went like, well, I didn't know they were going to give me this to play. Like this, now my work is kind of easy, you know? My sort of dumb metaphor for acting very often is it's all like hunting for treasure, right? You're trying to find like what's the gold of this character that I'm trying to dig up. And sometimes you read something and you go, this is a treasure map. I know where the X is. I know where it's buried. It might be hard work to dig and get there to the bottom of it and lift this chest up, but I know exactly where I'm digging. And when things are poorly written, it feels like you're just getting a note that says, please look for treasure. And now you're on the beach with a metal detector and you're digging everywhere and you spend hours digging a hole that goes nowhere and then you have to dig a new one or whatever. And so it's always much better to read something and go, I know exactly where to dig and I know what I'm going to find there, right? And you read the script and you go, well, they're offering me the exact thing I wanted to try to do here. It felt like a perfect construction for this character. I think, you know, as you said, there was a real focus from everyone working on both of these shows to try to not just pay respect to the history of MOTU, but really try to incorporate as much of it as they could, to not be ignorant of all the different corners. And beyond that, even, I think, to try to challenge themselves to tie together corners that used to be disparate. Because one of the things that's really tricky about MOTU, in my opinion, is basically from the get-go, the lore, the canon, is at odds with itself. Unlike something like, say, Marvel Comics or, you know, most source materials where it starts at one place and whoever is writing whatever the first medium is that these characters exist in, that's basically the definitive text, the starter text, and then things are built on top of it and they're spread out. But you're able to go, well, you know, the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby run of Fantastic Four, that's really the important thing that everything else springs from. And anything that's added later in Hanna-Barbera cartoons or this or that, that's secondary, you know, pick and choose. MOTU, it's like, as I'm sure you know, was developed in this very sort of disjointed way where you have a team working on the toys and you have a team working on the mini comics. And then you have, you know, after those two things are kind of happening parallel to each other, you then have Lou Scheimer and Filmation brought in to develop the cartoon show. And they're given a lot of autonomy to develop a lot of things further that weren't part of the toy line, like the Sorceress and Orko. And so you basically, from the get-go, had three similar but slightly different paths that these stories were being developed on. And I think that means, as much as these series have tried, in a way that really excites me, to pull those things together and also pull things from the live-action movie and pull things from the classics bios and pull from all these different areas, there are always going to be things that don't totally fit together, right? Yeah. And the other part of this is, it was not, you know, we were talking earlier about who would have the foresight to know to keep the nightlight in mint condition? Who would know it would be that important 40 years later, right? I think the people working on all these different areas of MOTU had no idea that we would be here obsessing over 40 years later, you know? Mm-hmm. And so there's certain parts of like these sacred texts that you have to try to figure out how to line up. And so I think it's a struggle sometimes to tell new stories in MOTU where if you're trying to take everything that's ever been said as irrefutable word, some of it's going to butt up against each other. And I think you look at Orko in that way, and you're like, well, there's something that kind of doesn't make sense here about this guy, right? I mean, even just the way you were describing him of, he's telling me he's this all-powerful wizard, he's got this cool girlfriend, and it's like, yeah, you're making him sound like that guy who lies in high school and is like, well, actually, like on the weekends, I'm like, I got my cool girlfriend who's in Trala, and I scored like 20 touchdowns, but none of you saw it. You know, like there's this sort of part
Well,
of
that would
Orko
be awesome, but we actually saw it in episodes.
totally.
That girlfriend was
No,
real.
Driel exists. No, of
Yeah,
course. I'm not denying her for a second. But there was, there's some gray area there. And there's all these different readings of him, but the reality is they wrote a lot of episodes. And a lot of it they were making up as they went along.
Mm-hmm.
And as we said, Orko wasn't even in the mini comics or the toys to begin with, all these sorts of things. So I think it just makes sense when you're telling new stories around existing characters and properties. I think there's a certain amount of, like, to go back to my treasure hunting metaphor, there's a certain amount of like archaeology and excavation you have to do, right? You have to sort of take a step back and like look at the fossils you've dug up and go like, okay, wait, so how does this logically fit together? How do you like build something new out of all of this? And it just felt very apparent to me when I read it, even though it was different than what I had knew from what I'd known from Orko as a character in the past. I went, this makes so much emotional sense that this is his story.
I think it was great that you guys did
yes,
that.
Yeah,
for me, the power
it felt like
of
a necessary change to me. Yeah.
Yeah, the power of MOTU, I think, is this. The strength of MOTU is its many incarnations. And
Yes, I agree.
Don't know of another IP that I can say that about. I've been in other fandoms that they'll have those canon battles.
Mm-hmm.
No, that didn't happen. That's old continuity, and this is the current continuity, and everything is so structured, and everything else is just fan fiction. But here, we have like Filmation, we have the original mini comics, we have the DC comics, we have New Adventures, we have the movie, the 1987 movie, 2002 series, the classic bios. I mean, we have so much that you could pick what you like. And it's like getting the toys, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's your world. You could play with them how you want to. When I got Many Faces, I thought he was a villain.
Yeah.
Be honest with you, I never like read the mini comics. I would just sort of rip the figure out and start playing. And I saw that green monster face, and I'm like, this thing's a villain, and that scary robot. So that's the way I played, and I think like the lore is that way too, and it's so marvelous. I've never witnessed that anywhere else, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And even, I mean, just to go back to the toys, like infamously, the paintings on the card backs barely match the original figures, The Orko, or not the Orko, I'm sorry, the merman that you're playing with looks so different than the merman that's painted on the back of the box. And so there are these internal canons that are being built in the head of every kid who's engaging with this stuff at the first time. I mean, I go to conventions. I went to PowerCon a couple of years ago when the first season came out, and you talk to people, and it's like, I met a guy who, and it's not like this guy's a one-off. There are tons of guys like this, but who was like mini comic purist. For him, it was like he likes the canon of the sort of what's now dubbed Ular, right?
Yeah.
That He-Man was like a guy in a cave from a tribe who met the Green Goddess. He was basically just like a barbarian who was handed the harness and the sword and got this power. And it's like, that was his version of it. And for him, once the mini comics started developing further, once they started linking into Filmation, once Prince Adam entered, he was out. And I'm like, that's a guy who's out at the earliest possible moment you could be out, right? For him, it's the absolute first step of the thing was right for him. And then at that point, the story starts to negate itself. And for him, he's out. And I don't view that as a negative. I'm like, I think it's what's interesting is by the very nature of this thing being set up almost in this accidental choose your own adventure way, and it also being a property that, like, the toys existed before the cartoon. It's why the mini comics were created, because Mattel was worried kids would need some narrative. But some kids are reading the mini comics and some kids like you aren't, and are creating their own things. And it's like all evolving in real time. And I think, I find canon battles often very exhausting. And it's not that I don't think it matters, because I do, but I also think, especially the era we're living in like such an absurd there's so much more of this stuff being made than we ever could have imagined when we were kids, right?
Yeah.
Like it's sort of the degree to which we're all spoiled of just like all of these characters and properties that we were in love with, not only being made lovingly at large scales, but being made over and over and over again. You know, all these things existing. The fact that there's now a place, you know, and we're two dorks talking about a dorky subject, but you're like, the fact that like a multiverse is a concept that any layperson on the street understands now.
Who would have thought?
Who would have thought, right? That for me, the beauty of that is like all of this becomes less sacrosanct, because when you're in the 90s and Batman and Robin comes out and it bombs and people hate it, right?
Mm.
The feeling is, well, now we're not going to get Batman movies ever again. You know, there was genuinely this feeling of they have ruined Batman movies forever. That was it. We had a good run. Batman's on ice. Over. And when Batman Begins comes out 7 years later, it felt like an eternity. We had to go 7 years. We thought we'd maybe never get another Batman movie. How are they going to reboot this? And then now it's like we're living in a time with 3 Jokers existing simultaneously, just in live action movies, you know? And so I think there's something freeing to, as much as Revelation and Revolution are trying to pull from everything that MOTU's ever been and trying to tell this big grand story. This is, at the end of the day, just a story. It is a version. And there have been many before it, and there will be many after it, and there are many happening simultaneously to our show that are different, you know? But it just felt like for the story that everyone wanted to tell, those changes to Orko felt really logical. And once again, I had no part in deciding on those changes, but when I read them, I went, that makes so much sense. And this lines up so thoroughly with how I would want to play this guy. You know, what I would want to get to here, because even Kevin saying, I'm sorry for another long run unanswered, but that, you know, we want to make the badass Orko that people get tattoos of, that win people over who used to dislike Orko. The thing I love is they didn't choose to do that by making Orko incredibly metal, right? They didn't choose to do that by having Orko Hulk out, get tough, and become a traditional kind of badass. Mm-hmm. It was fundamentally the same character, right? And it's a backstory that sort of makes sense with everything he's been before, but also this sort of badass moment is this moment of very vulnerable sacrifice for him. Yeah. You know, I mean, he is displaying his power on a scale we had never seen before. That is cool and impressive. But the bigger thing is that he's going into a situation which he knows he's overpowered. The badass thing is that there's some degree of conscious sacrifice in what he's doing. Yeah. And his final words as he's fighting Scareglow are him telling his friends how much he loves them, which is very in line with what Filmation was. You know, it's the kind of stuff that people found annoying about Orko, of like, oh, he's really sappy and he's goofy and he's silly and whatever. And I just love being able to create a context around that in which the same type of thing, the stakes have elevated and the emotion is elevated, but you're not betraying who he was. You're not turning him into something different.
Yeah. You know, that line, you know, why he's doing magic like a badass. When he says, you know, look, Lynn, I'm doing it, you know, that brings him back to, that's the connection for me. That's the, you know, that he's not this badass in Toronto, you know, that but he realized if he just believes in himself a little, that's,
and I love that moment because it's him calling out that he's even surprised that he's pulling it off.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's like a little kid saying, like, look, I'm walking.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a good one.
Yeah.
You know, and speaking of look, Lynn, and all that, and I can't help but feel bad for you, meaning Well, I saw this wonderful video where actor Mark Hamill and Lena Headey were voicing their roles for Masters of the Universe Revelation in the same studio,
Yeah.
feeding off each other's energy. And then boom, the pandemic lockdown happened. And not to trivialize the true impact, because
Sure.
our hearts pour out to all the families that lost loved ones during that mess. That is really what's important here. But
Yeah.
recognizing that and looking beyond it, would you have been in the booth too, say opposite Lena Headey and doing that
No.
scene?
No. I mean, there are larger repercussions of this, but I live in New York. I'm based out of New York. Most of the voice cast is in LA. I think I may be even the only person of the main cast who is East Coast based. So it was always going to be you very, very rarely, if ever, in voice acting get to work with other actors. That's like a really kind of special treat. There are a couple shows, The Simpsons, I know for a long time, if they don't still, will record together. Bob's Burgers will record together. It more often happens in comedy, where they specifically want certain timings, or certainly sometimes if there is not even the whole cast, but like Timon and Pumbaa, they want the two of them recording together because the banter is so aligned like that. So
is that relatively new based on technology? Like, say 15 years ago, it was a mandatory thing to be
separate or to be together?
Together.
I think it's less about technology, honestly, and it's more about editing. That the art of voice acting is so much weirdly about giving people puzzle pieces. You're working in such an odd order because it's basically, scripts, then in some cases storyboards second, in some cases voice record second, then storyboards, then animation, and then they go back around and have you re-record certain things based on how the animation is shaking out. But part of it is, it's like your job as a voice actor is to cut out a bunch of different puzzle pieces of different shapes and leave them a bunch of options so that they can then later go, oh, you know what? We actually need the piece with this side coming off so that could fit into this piece of what this other person did. And scheduling, it's hard to get a whole cast of people in the same room at the same time, but it's also just, it's easier in editing to cut something together to make it sound like it's overlapping than it is to have two people talking and then split it up later if you need it to be.
And here I thought you were missing out. Okay.
No. I mean, I would love to get to work with any of the other people in this cast. It's not something where I feel like I'm being left out. Okay. I think Mark and Lena working together was probably like a rare occurrence and a lucky sort of happenstance that they realized, oh, their interplay is really important together. We might get something special if we have them in the same room for a couple of these scenes. Scheduling wise, they're both available. But I think basically everyone else in the cast did their stuff solo. The exception to that being when most of the people were in LA, if they could realize, oh, he's coming in at 12:15, she's coming in at 12:30, maybe we could get them to overlap for a second. I knew I was always going to be pretty isolated just by nature of being on the other side of the country.
Even before the shutdown.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry for giving you another very long-winded answer, but I feel like I had done at least 80% of my recording before the lockdown started. Okay. So as I said, I started recording in January. I think I had maybe 2 sessions in January where I really did the bulk of everything, where you have these marathon days where you're doing like 5 episodes in a row. And obviously Orko's in different episodes to different degrees of that first season. Mm-hmm. But I had done the bulk of everything before the lockdown happened. And then the animation process takes so long. And then they sort of circled back. I'd done most of it in January and February, and then maybe towards the end of that year, October or November, they brought me back in, and it was the first time I had been back in a studio since the lockdown had started, because there were a couple other animated shows I was on at the time that still needed new records done. And those I had to do in my bedroom, like underneath bed sheets. You'd have to make your own sort of soundproofing with a comforter. You get on like a StreamYard like we're on right now. And
Yeah, I think I saw Tiffany on social media,
yeah.
making out of a closet, maybe.
Yes, right. They guide you through it because they've now done it with a bunch of other people. But they're like directing you over Zoom or StreamYard, and they're telling you, we find it helps if you put 2 pillows over your head. We find it's better if you close the door and you have more winter jackets around you. All these sorts of stuff. So there were other shows I had to do that for, which is tough. It's also just tough. I find it's tough for something to feel professional when it's happening in your bedroom or in your closet. Whatever degree of like headspace.
I can imagine you under like a feather bed with a flashlight.
No, it was true. And it was like one hand holding the comforter up and then a mic here and a screen here and all this sort of stuff. It feels very silly. I was very lucky in spite of the horrible circumstances of the world at that time.
Yeah.
I got all of my proper recording done before lockdown, and the moment that they needed me to come in and do pickups or rewrites was when they had sort of figured out the protocols to be able to safely have me go in a studio again, which was basically the safest form of acting you could do at that point, because it's like a hermetic, airtight booth by yourself that they sanitize for an hour before and after you get in there. So I all this to say, it was an isolated process, but I don't think that was changed at all by the pandemic. The thing I do feel like I missed out on, which is just as a dork was the bummer for me, was we would have gone to San Diego Comic-Con as a cast, and I would have gotten to hang out with these people. We would have done this rung of press, this rung of press. There was all the press things, and between the pandemic and then the SAG and WGA strikes last year, in both cases, there were itineraries planned where I was like, I'm going to get to sit at a table with him and her and her.
Yeah, you were going to do that round table. Yeah. And they were going to announce Keith David, right?
Yes. I was going to do, there was a plan to do, we were going to do a panel at San Diego, but I know afterwards there was going to be a signing of the new poster, and I think it was going to be Kevin, who's the one guy I've got to spend a lot of time with now in person, because he spends so much time in Jersey on the East Coast. But I think it was just going to be Kevin, Keith, David, and I. And I was like texting all my friends, like, you're not going to believe this. I'm going to get to go to Comic-Con and just sit at a table with Keith David for like 2 hours. This is my dream, is just to talk to this guy about everything, about his entire career. So yeah, I think anytime you get to record with any other actor in voiceover, in animation, that's like a very rare gift. It is not the norm. It is not expected. I've not been lucky enough to have that happen yet. Maybe at some point it will. Very often when I was doing my records, I was doing them with Kevin playing the other parts, who's really good at playing the other parts, or Colette Sunderman, who's the voice director on the show and is really good at playing the other parts, but also to this sort of puzzle piece. And sometimes it helps if they're giving you the line in and you're saying the line afterwards. Sometimes it helps if you run a page of dialogue back and forth just for rhythm or whatever it is.
Sure.
More often than not, you're going one line at a time. You're taking it in isolation, and either they give you the cue and then you say it 3 times in a row, and they say, let's try it like this, and then you do it another 3 times in a row. But the process is very often you go one line by line.
It's amazing how it sounds put together.
It
really sounds like you're all in a room doing like a cast.
I know. It's a weird process. I love it, frankly. It's my favorite kind of acting I've ever done. When I started doing voice acting
over,
absolutely, unquestionably. And there are certain aspects of what I now call body acting, my own very informal term, human body acting. There are certain things that I love that you don't get out of voice acting. The number one is that chemistry with another person.
Sure.
And there's the feeling of staying in a moment and playing a scene and just staying there and all that sort of stuff that is fun. But there is something very freeing for me about voice acting, and even the aspects of it that are weirdly technical, I find very exciting. But yes, no, I find most good shows, and certainly MOTU works this way, when you're working with good people, they very much say, how are you most comfortable working? What's best for you? Would you rather I read every other line with you and we go through it straight as a scene and then we reset and go back to the beginning of the scene? Would you rather take it one line at a time? Would you rather do each take we record is you saying the line 5 times and then we give you notes? Right. And part of the flexibility of it is they go, what would it sound like if there's like an angrier version? And then you give them 5 angrier versions in a row. And sometimes they go, nah, that doesn't work. Or they go, interesting option. We have that. We know we have that. Or sometimes they go, oh, no, that's good. There's something there. And maybe let's push it further, you know? So not only are you not doing it in the same room as other people, but you're also trying different versions of it all the time rather than committing to one, which I like because I'm a very anxious person and a sort of obsessive perfectionist in a lot of ways. And when you're on camera and you're trying to get the perfect take, which doesn't exist, it's an illusion, right?
Yeah.
That perfect take is relying on everything working perfectly all at once. It's not just you doing everything you're aiming to do as an actor, but it's you being in sync with the other actors in the scene. It's the lighting working. It's the mics not malfunctioning. It's the camera movement happening at the right time. It's all that sort of stuff. There's so many X factors. Versus what I love about voice acting is you're kind of given your space. Here's your room. Here's your time. Give us everything you've got. Try every version of it. You hand it all over to them. And then like a year and a half later, they bring you back this result all meshed together. And you go, wow, I don't even remember doing that. Or that plays so much differently than I thought when it's drawn out now. Or now that I get to hear what the other person in the scene is doing.
You know, it's funny how you were communicating how well you respond to the direction and trying it different ways. It just takes me back to the 40th anniversary San Diego Comic-Con event. Where William Shatner was like the opposite. You know, Kevin Smith recounted that story where it's like, you know, Kevin, let me do this. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
You know, and at 90 years old, I think he is. You know, he's
3.
Oh, really? Wow.
Maybe.
You know what? Let's jump right into that spoiler section, right?
Please.
Here, so we can just talk about him. So, if you haven't watched Masters of the Universe Revolution yet and don't want it spoiled, I recommend wherever you're listening or watching this podcast, press pause, go watch it on Netflix. It's out right now. And then come back and hit that resume button because there's plenty of spoilers ahead. So we were saying like he's like 93.
Yeah.
I tell you.
He has his own way of working. He comes in with his method. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what? He's basically like a knight in the industry, you know. He hasn't been knighted, I don't think. He's not Sir William Shatner.
I don't know what the Canadian form of knighting is.
I don't know either.
Yeah.
So generally speaking, so like Masters of the Universe Masters of the Universe Revolution, I absolutely loved. But it almost felt like a different animal to me to some degree tonally. In a way, this is not going to be the best example, but like a movie Alien to Aliens, you know, in a way.
Yeah.
But basically, less introspection and prose this time around and more excitement and mayhem, you know, and both are winning formulas. But did anything strike you? Did you notice anything personally when you first read that Revolution script?
You know, reading it's not like it felt very different in format. There's obviously the change in the amount of episodes, right? And thus like the amount of real estate there exists to tell this story. You know, I think there's a misconception that because of the way Revelation was released, that those were 2 different seasons, you know? I mean, I don't even remember if still on Netflix it's listed as a part 1, part 2, or it's now just all listed as season 1.
So I have screenshots, Griffin.
Yeah.
In some countries overseas, it's listed as season 1 and
Yeah.
season 2. So at first, people were like telling other fans, "What are you, crazy? It's part 1, part 2, you
Yes.
idiot!" And I'm like, guys, if they're from a different country, this is how it's been presented to them.
Yes.
And it's
I mean,
Netflix. I'm talking Netflix.
no, absolutely. Yeah. I will just say that was the one area that was seriously affected by the pandemic. Was it disrupted the shift to work from home, slowed down the animation cycle, and those 10 episodes were always constructed, written, outlined, designed, plotted to all come out on the same day. The opportunity for people to watch all 10 at once if they wanted to just binge the whole thing and take it in as one long 5-hour story. And that got bumped because of the pandemic and changes in workflow and all of that. And I think, funny enough, I think the big thing was because lead times on toys are so long, the first wave of the Revelation Masterverse figures were going to be hitting shelves at that date when they had originally intended for all 10 episodes to come out.
Yeah, they actually came out a month before in June.
Right. So they knew, I mean, the point was summer 2021 was a goal they had to hit.
Griffin, they had Skelegod as the first wave figure.
I have my own complaints about that. I don't quite understand what was going on there. I have never gotten a full explanation of why they would do that. It felt like a very bizarre choice.
Yes.
But yes, that was on shelves early. They had just set the toys to come out in conjunction with the show. They knew all 10 episodes weren't going to be ready at that point in time, and the choice was made to cut it in the middle. We can get the first 5 100% done by the original date. The funny thing is, I think when people, I know this is a very circuitous answer to what you asked me, but when people saw the second half of season 1 of Revelation and projected, oh, this plot point is a response to the reaction from the fans to part 1. Whatever the dates were, Revelation part 1 comes out on a Friday. That following Monday, I did my final voice record session for part 2. And at that point, the animation was 99.9% done. The only reason I was doing a voice record session that late, that close to it being finished, was because they realized in season 1 that because Orko doesn't have a mouth, it is easier to change his dialogue later.
The Scareglow poem, right? The nursery rhyme.
Correct, exactly. So there were things where they would look at scenes and go, we're missing a line here that would make sense of this scene. To have any other character say it would cost a lot of money and take a lot of time to reanimate their faces. Orko, we can just put the words in there and try to match up to what his body's doing at that point in time. So all of season 1 was almost ready. And they had to push it a little bit rather than push the first half. All this to be said, season 2, Revolution, is the first thing written since people have gotten to watch all of season 1. So there definitely was some consideration about what did people like in the season? What did people dislike in the season? All of that. I think it's very much still what was part of the larger intent when they sort of thought out a multi-season arc for this show. But the first thing you notice is like, oh, it's 5 episodes. It's going to move a lot faster. When I get these scripts and I hear it's only a 5-episode season, and to be clear, this isn't what happened with season 1. There's not a secret part 2 second half of the season coming later.
I was hoping for you to say that.
This is the full season as it is right now.
That's what I was secretly hoping for the longest time, that you and the rest of the team, had this in the can, and like 5 months later, you'd be surprised.
Look, I wish, but I also think to a certain degree, not communicating that up front with season 1 was a bit of a problem. I think there'd been a little bit more clarity in communication.
Well, I think it would work if it was more defined a story.
Yes.
I mean, I loved Masters of the Universe Revelation, but I can remove myself and understand people who are upset with He-Man being killed.
Yes.
Ended part 1 or season 1,
Yes.
depending on where you lived, with He-Man being stabbed and looking like he was killed again.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And, you know, in a vacuum,
Right.
I can see how that can frustrate some people where, you know, you don't go in the back of your mind say,
I totally get it. I like completely get it. And that was obviously designed to be a somewhat shocking cliffhanger moment. But as the original intent was, that moment would be followed by a button that says autoplay next episode, and episode 6 was right there to begin right away.
Where in Revolution you had
Yeah.
that beginning, you have a middle and an end, and it
Yes.
doesn't feel like it's a cliffhanger, that you
Right.
have complete story.
That's my thing. I mean, I was a little worried seeing it was only 5 episodes. Is this going to feel really rushed? Is it going to feel really crammed? Or the opposite, are they going to have to simplify their story to only fit 5 episodes? And I feel like it's a real hearty meal. I feel like there's a lot going on there. There's probably more action relative to dialogue, as you said, but I also don't think that's some kind of strategic shift. I think that's a matter of when there's less space to tell the story. It's show don't tell, you know? It's how can you convey a lot of this through action, not just literal fighting action, but also just through character behavior and all of that. But I also think, a friend of mine told me his complaint with watching Revelation, which was interesting because I felt like I hadn't heard this spelled out this way by anyone, but it makes a lot of sense to me. That he was watching the first episode of Revelation that ends with the sort of twist of He-Man and Skeletor killing each other in battle, right? And he said to me, my friend Christian said, I love that as a story twist, and I get where it's coming from, and this place of, the Filmation series would just reset the battle over and over again because they couldn't really fight because of censorship and violence and Saturday morning guidelines and all of that. So we're getting to see the real knockdown, drag out sword fights that we never got to see on the original show. But B, the stakes were always a little bit nerfed because it's a cartoon show. It has to reset back to status quo. And let's take ownership of what this show could do that the original show couldn't do, which is have the terrible thing happen in the first episode. And what happens if the terrible thing happens? And how is the universe shaken up by that? What are all the ripple effects of that? And he said, but I just wish there was more status quo. I was so happy to be watching a new MOTU cartoon for the first time in like almost 20 years that when I'm watching the first part where everything's normal before it gets disrupted, I was a little bit frustrated that I didn't get more of the normal. And as you said, the thinking creatively was, well, the normal is the previous shows you've watched. The normal is the history that you're bringing to it. The normal is the mini comics. It's Filmation. It's Mike Young Productions. It's the toys you had. It's the DC Comics. The normal is the history of MOTU that you're holding on to in the back of your head before you watch the show. And this is a sequel to all of that, to the history of MOTU, which is why there's sort of this wild second act twist, because it's like this is the second act to the last 40 years of stuff, right? I think what you get in Revolution is that now we're making a sequel to our first season. So your first season is everything disrupted, everything goes wrong, right? The world is turned upside down. Every character is tested. People die and come back from the dead and evolve and transform and devolve and all these sorts of things. By the end of season 1, we got to this place where you have a new normal, right? Some things have reset to the way we know them. Some things are now a little bit different than they were before, like Teela being the sorceress, but that's something that was always kind of destined to happen. Yes. And Revolution, you get to start out with this new normal where, there are dramatic things that happen right off the bat in episode 1, but I don't think anyone's going to view any of these moves as rug pulls. because now we've sort of been able to build our own story. It's our own world. It's our own sort of corner of the MOTU universe, and we're building off of that.
By the way, you say rug pull, and it reminded me of the Lynn line, you're nothing but a bait and switch.
Yeah.
I was like, that's a little meta.
Yeah. Well, look, my feeling in all of that, I'll speak with full transparency here, right? Because I'm obviously biased because I work on this show. But that having been said, I am a nearly lifelong fan of this brand. I genuinely am. I really enjoy this show. I watch it and I enjoy it as a fan, away from my own contribution. And I feel very invested in the project, and I like everyone who works on it. But it's not like I'm a writer. I'm receiving the scripts and reading them for the first time the way many are going to watch the episodes for the first time, going, I don't know what happens next. I'm curious. Am I going to like that? Am I going to like this? There's certain things I like more or less than other things, what have you. But when I read the Revelation script and I got to the end of episode 1, I went, that's going to flip people out. I wasn't naive about it. I went, people are going to flip out when they see that. I was also assuming, I thought, well, this is the benefit of being on Netflix. If this was airing on Cartoon Network in 2002, if this was part of the Friday Toonami block, and episode 1 ends with the two of them dying, and then you're told wait a week until episode 2, I think there would be protests in the streets. I thought this is the benefit of binging and streaming, that it's all there to watch at once. That was obviously disrupted. But the bait and switch thing, I think, yes, there's a meta joke there, there's a knowing joke there, but it's more, if you tell people what the rug pull is going to be, then it has no effectiveness as a story. It wasn't like there was an active sense of deception in terms of we're trying to sell people a false bill of goods, trick them into watching our show. It was, you can't tell them going in what the surprises are going to be. You don't want to describe the roller coaster, and especially because part of the design was to build a season where you start out with status quo, you basically deconstruct everything in order to reconstruct it again.
It was treated like it was some sort of devious intent to fool everyone by
which it wasn't. Look, people are allowed to dislike it. I'm not going to tell anyone they were wrong about it. But yeah, the only stuff that irks me is the projection of intent like that, right? Because I read way too much of the response just because I've already been online in these corners of the internet, following these accounts, looking at these videos, what have you. And, I read many criticisms that I disagree with, but I think are entirely valid and well thought out, well articulated.
Sure.
But any sort of assumption of what the strategy was on the part of the people making the show, I felt was 99.9% of the time wildly off base. And it was really just in the name of trying to tell a story that would be surprising to people, so that they could experience it for themselves in real time while watching it.
Yeah, Kevin was pretty genuine. He was trying to, like you said, he was just trying to hide his big secret that He-Man was going to be killed, and it was going to be a world without He-Man story.
Right.
He did consciously try to insert He-Man in every episode, if it was through flashbacks or Fear He-Man, even, that's confronting Tila down in, and
a lot of Adam.
Well, that was the great thing, I thought, with Revelation, is, like I was mentioning to you with Orko, is Masters of the Universe Revelation was the first time I actually fell in love with Adam. Adam was another character on that Filmation show. At least as a kid, I was like, all right, turn to He-Man, turn into He-Man. I mean, I didn't dislike him, but he wasn't my favorite. But until I learned about the heart and the sacrifice, this show really presented it to me, that I was just like, wow, Adam's like one of my favorite characters now. I'm not wishing him away on the screen. I want him to be Adam. I want to realize that this character's greatest power is his ability to give up the power.
Yes. It's kind of classic Spider-Man No More stuff, which I love. I mean, it's like it's a kind of cornerstone of fantasy, superhero, sci-fi, pulp storytelling is the second story. You kind of, you have your origin stories, you have your understanding of the power, acquisition of the power, all that sort of stuff. And then the most interesting way to test your characters are, what if you take away the thing? Who are they without that, I think it was like, all of that was done as, it's one of those things that I find so interesting about MOTU is that it's called Masters of the Universe. And we casually call it He-Man a lot, right? And the Filmation show was called He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. But the center of the title has always been the Masters of the Universe. It has been this universe. It has been this collection of characters. And it's sort of like removing He-Man from the equation in Revelation. I know we said we were getting into Revolution spoilers, and now we're just doubling down on Revelation. But it allows you to test the other characters in interesting ways. Yeah. Who are all of them without him? And who is Adam without He-Man, Mm-hmm. And it's all in service of trying to get back to status quo, but back to status quo with a sort of new understanding, And I think Revolution has that, where you're just like, these are characters who have now gone through the whole journey of Revelation and feel a lot more secure in who they are. They're more clearly defined in who they are and what their roles are. But then, I think very cleverly, Kevin and all the writers came up with some really good tests of these characters. So we're talking about the sort of the expectations, the destiny, part of Adam. It's right there in his creation is he's a prince. Mm-hmm. At some point, he needs to become a king. And almost everyone else who has held the power of Grayskull before has been the ruler of Grayskull, right? Randor has never gotten the power. It weirdly skipped, a generation or several generations. And so there's this weird bifurcated, like, he's the protector of Grayskull, but he's the prince. There's a birthright versus the power that he acquired. And I think, when they started designing this series, a lot of it was looking at what are kind of the great stories that have always been hovering around, that have been in the dirt underneath MOTU, but have never actually bloomed, that have never come to the surface, like Teela's destiny and her birthright. And I feel like Revolution really starts with a similar thing, which is, does Adam want to be king? Yeah. Like, he's gotten to a place now where he has a new relationship to his status and his identity as He-Man, and that part of himself, and what that responsibility is, and what he feels like he owes his people. But does he want to be the guy sitting in the throne, ruling the land, which is like a somewhat bureaucratic position?
Yeah. To put a bow on what you were saying about Revelation, mm-hmm. Is I think there were two trains of thought, where it was, some people wanted the cartoon they had as kids, mm-hmm. And they wanted that childlike feeling again.
Yeah.
And some people wanted this show to grow up with them.
Yes.
Like, wow, this is, this MOTU aged with me, and now as an adult, look at all of this subtext. And
I think it's very similar to the classics line of figures, where it's like, right, 2000X was a reinterpretation.
Yeah,
we're going to redesign these characters. We're going to make a new vibe, new energy. Classics was, as sort of stated as its intent, that toy line was supposed to be, here are sort of the toys that were in your mind's eye. If you go back and look at the vintage figure, oh, this was softer than you remember, and this was kind of lumpy and whatever. But can we make the toys that felt like the toys you were playing with, and plus them up and scale them up and add articulation and sculpting? And I think that was sort of the intent of this show, was to try to make the show that felt like the logical kind of evolution of what you grew up with and the way it sort of felt in your mind.
Yeah, and I think that the sequel Revolution here, and I'm not saying this in a bad way, but it's sort mm-hmm. of lands itself somewhere between Revelation and we saw as a child. The subtext is a little less, mm-hmm. the deep emotional impact is a little less, and the action and the fun is a little more. And that's why I see this as like two different animals. And and they're both fun for different reasons. I do think Masters of the Universe Revolution could have benefited maybe from one more episode. Well, let me ask you this. And then
Yeah, I mean, I was talking with a bunch of the writers and producers last week, and I think everyone was saying, we wish we could have had one more, you know. And I don't think you feel it in. I think they get a lot in there in 5. I think there's just that feeling of if we could have had a little more room to breathe. I will say I was like very satisfied watching it, and I do think watching the 5, it feels like you're just kind of watching a long movie now. You know,
Mhm.
it feels like kind of a really killer animated MOTU movie.
Well, I'll give you a perfect example where I just wish we had that one more episode to breathe. And it involves your character. There's this great team up between Orko and Gildor, which, by the way, I love.
Yeah.
The Gildor thing.
Yeah.
I have them too.
That's how that team up goes.
I have that team up too. I actually did a top 10 Masterverse figures, and that set was on my top 10.
Where was it?
On YouTube.
No, I'm saying what number did we make?
Oh,
I don't know. I asked.
Where did I rank?
Where did I rank?
I think it was somewhere like 8 or something like that.
What did you have at number 1?
The Masterverse New Eternia web store figure.
Okay. So you were including New Eternia.
Yes, including New Eternia. There was something like 35 figures released for the year or something like that.
Yeah.
So, and there were so many good ones. It was hard to juggle.
I'm biased towards the Revolution ones, obviously, but the Man at Arms Deluxe, that was my favorite. I just thought like the sort of the options of that figure.
It's great.
The amount of different versions you could get out of him. Yeah,
you could have him home, like in his little hut, or you can have him. I actually created that little cloak you get. I actually created a hood for him.
Yes.
Sort of wrap it around. And
I just saw all the pieces there. Yeah. And I will say, like, Orko's always been my favorite character. Man at Arms has always been my favorite toy. I just think Man at Arms and Trapjaw are the two characters that look the coolest.
Oh yeah.
And translate the best to toys, probably because they have the most sort of gadgets and modularity and all that sort of stuff. But anyway, sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, Trapjaw had a utility belt. I mean, how cool is that? And then he had the articulated jaw, and
even just the at the top. Yes. You're like, there are like 5 different ways to play with this guy. Yeah.
He was amazing, versus say like, Faker, which was just a blue He-Man. I had problems with him as a kid. Oh yeah. Well, actually, I love the Masterverse figure. That actually made
the Masterverse figure is great, but I like the way they did it at the beginning of Revelation, where they kind of split the difference between the cartoon, where Faker just looks exactly like He-Man, but then making it clear it's kind of projection over a robot. Anyway, I'm sorry, you were saying the Orko Gildor.
Okay, so here's this great team up, which I love, and we could say it now. Ted Biaselli, the voice of Gildor, and here you are with Orko, and I love the jokes, by the way, where he's calling you like short jokes, calling you half pint.
Yeah,
and
and I love that
line is like, it's a tall order, and that's why they didn't ask you, Orko.
Gildor is like the only character that Orko will ever be rude to, like even someone like Evil Lynn, he's trying to appeal to her humanity. And I feel like there's this really cool kind of metatextual, like they're bringing to it the baggage of almost, it's unspoken, Orko hating that Gildor replaced him in the movie, right? Like,
yeah, and that's what I mean about that one more episode. I kind of wish we had one more episode where we would have been given a Gildor and Orko, it would have completed an amazing story arc, and one that explained why they didn't like each other.
Yeah.
And then we see the worst of friends become the best of friends.
Yeah.
Ending with some sort of tall compliment made by Gildor towards Orko at the end. And I would have loved that whole arc. We've seen that arc before, but it's always fulfilling. Yeah. And when I watched it, I was like, I wish I had room for that. I wish I knew why they disliked each other, and then I wish I got to see them like each other.
Can I tell you what my read is on it? And this is just my own internal canon. I don't know if the writers and the animators for the show agree with me on this.
Okay.
My read is that it truly is some version of the 87 movie happened, right?
Yep.
Which we've seen, characters, we've seen Pig Boy, we've seen other elements of the 87 movie worked into these 2 seasons, right?
Man at Arms references it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So
he
it's
said,
just,
we went on that adventure together.
Right. So I think Orko just genuinely, like a small child, hates that for this one big adventure that's always talked about, they chose to have Gildor show up instead of him, It's like and I think it's the way a lot of us experience watching the live action movie for the first time, where you're like tilting your head and going like, this isn't Orko, but he's got the big ears and he's funny and he's little. It's so close and yet so different at the same time. Why are they replacing this character with someone like this? And I think Orko feels the same way of not like, it's not like there was a mission and they brought Mechanic instead of him. Right? It's like for some reason they went to a different universe. They traveled to a different land entirely with the other guy, and he's never gotten over that.
That's cool. I like that. And they could have maybe even accomplished that with a line, like when Man at Arms brought up that old adventure, and Orko would say something, and I told you I wanted to go, or something like that. And
there's the other thing too of just like, a thing I love about this series is really drilling down into the magic versus technology thing, because it's one of the things that makes MOTU so unique, is that from the get-go you have these 2 things existing side by side that very often in most properties you pick one or the other. This is a world of magic or it's a world of sci-fi technology. It's one or the other. MOTU has always been both. It's always been robots and wizards and dragons and monsters, and cyborgs and all this stuff.
Swords and shields and spaceships.
Right. Yeah. Which is what I love about it. I always refer to it like, are you familiar with the garbage plate, the upstate New York delicacy?
I am not.
It was, I was working in Rochester last year, which is, I think, where it originates from. But it's a dish that's basically every good food put into one thing. It's like hamburger meat and tater tots and hot dogs and macaroni and cheese and everything. They call it a garbage plate because it's just like the scraps, but it's all the scraps that everyone likes in one bowl. And MOTU feels like that to me, where it's like, well, just have ninjas and knights, just
and a cowboy,
and a cowboy, and it's a robot cowboy, like all of that stuff. And I think Orko and Gildor, it's another one of these things where you're like, here's this story that's kind of right there that no one's taken the time to let rise up to the surface of. You got these 2 guys who occupy the same role and are so similar as characters, except one of them is magic and one of them is technology.
Yeah. Speaking of, and I was so happy to see Gildor there, but as we're talking about things, just, robot cowboys, Snout Spout, there's a scene with Snout Spout, which I love seeing him, but he's like spraying water at one of those techno robots.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what is that doing? It's just bouncing off the metal, but he's trying.
He's trying. He's trying. No, I mean, that was, Kevin did my podcast Blank Check. I guess it was about 2 years ago now. He's about to do another episode for us. But it was right when we were about to start recording Revolution. So I hadn't gotten the scripts yet, and he was explaining to me the big plot movements. And he was like, and Orko's big thing this season is he's forced to work with Gildor. And I went, Gildor? Like, a thing I don't think I'd even considered that you could put Gildor on the show, that you could work them into the same continuity. And then he similarly told me, he said, and Shatner, we just closed the deal. Shatner is going to be the main villain this season. And I went like, well, who's Shatner? It's Shatner playing Hordak? And he just went Keldor. And my mind was blown because I went like, I don't even understand how that's going to work. What do you mean? He's Keldor in flashbacks? And he went, just wait until you see the script. And I think it was so clever the way they did it. I know some people were upset because the Dark Horse comics had sort of implied a different backstory to Skeletor. I forget which of the series it was.
You mean, well, the one tied to Revelation, the prequel comics?
Yes.
Yeah. But I think that works. So, yeah, in Masters of the Universe Revelation prequel comic, we got to see his realm, his demon realm, and he had a wife and he had a child.
The sort of Gar past. Yeah.
Oh, no, this wasn't the Gar past. So this was the prequel comic.
Yes. I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
He has not been presented as a Gar yet. So
if
we go back, I've always been a fan of the demon origin of Skeletor, and I always preferred that to Keldor. And that's one of the great things about MOTU is, you could pick your lores and run with that. And in Filmation, he was always presented as a demon, and the same thing in the series Bible. And then in, of course, Masters of the Universe Revelation, he's mentioned as a demon in the intro, and then he called himself a interdimensional demon. And then as the comics came out, we had the Masterverse comics that was tied to the continuity. We have the prequel comics, and then the latest Forge of Destiny that showed us the Gar.
Right.
But when Skeletor was there, he still called himself a demon.
Yeah.
So then Masters of the Universe Revolution, and William Shatner as Keldor, and I was blown away for two reasons. First is that I never thought, I mean, if I just put my head in this 2 years back and say, someone says to me, like to you, William Shatner as Keldor, I'll be like, what? That doesn't work. That's not supposed to work.
I had trust in it, but I couldn't process what he was saying to me. I couldn't make sense of it. It was so outside of what I thought was, as you're saying, in the realm of possibility of what this show was building up to. And I had to sit on that as a secret for almost like 2 years, Yeah.
And as I watched it, it was amazing because suddenly William Shatner as Keldor became my favorite character in Masters of the Universe.
His performance is so good.
His performance is amazing. And this is coming from a guy that you would have told me, you would ask me 2 years ago, could Keldor be your favorite character? I would say, no. I prefer the demon origin, but they did this so well. And his performance was so magnificent that I fell in love with this. I mean,
and I think it also weirdly, it finds a way to kind of weave in every version of the Skeletor origin from a point of view, right? There's there's a really interesting dance I think this season does with sort of this sense, Skeletor's battle with his own sense of mythology. What does he believe to be true? What is he told is his truth? What is actually the truth? And that allows this sort of obscuring of who he is and where he came from, that gives us a taste of every version, any possible version that people could have an affinity to, and I think finds a way to respect all of them while ultimately coming out with an answer for this version, at least.
Yeah, when some people read the prequel comics that showed his demon life, not the Gar.
Right, they thought that was negating the Keldor.
Yes, and a lot of people also thought it wasn't negating Keldor and he was lying because there was some ambiguity to his story, And I was so happy. Lying feels like a cop-out. Like, I was telling this BS here and I'm really Keldor, ha. I think what really worked for me was the fact that he didn't even know that this was
the thing. And I
was convinced he was a demon for so long.
Well, and it's, Skeletor and Hordak have occupied the same story space before, but they also are, to a lesser extent, they have a little bit of the Gildor Orko dynamic where it's like, well, they occupied the same spot in different stories, right? Now, they've crossed paths far more in the history of the property, and there has been this developed sort of relationship of Hordak in the what am I trying to say here? The sort
hierarchy.
Yes, thank you. The hierarchy of power that was changed forever by Black Adam. Yes, the hierarchy that's sort of established and whatever. But if you're putting Hordak and Skeletor in the same story, you have to justify a reason. What is the story reason to have them in the same tale outside of just it's cool? It would be cool to have them both live here. And I think this sort of feeling of Skeletor being beholden to Hordak, this thing that's in a lot of the tellings of Skeletor's origin, Hordak being this being that kind of saved Skeletor, that gave him a chance, rebirth in this new form, and sort of cursed him in the process. To then bake into that the ultimate method of control and dominance that Hordak has thrown over Skeletor is depriving Skeletor of a sense of his own story. That he's been handing this narrative over to Skeletor, where Skeletor doesn't even really quite know who he is.
And I love that he chooses at the end to be Skeletor.
Yes.
He says, "My name is Skeletor." And
yes.
I know it was so well done, and I don't think, well, maybe, but I mean, there is some, it is some Hatfields and McCoys, being entrenched in that community. As you are on the org, there is those demon lovers, and there are those Keldor lovers, and they stood on each side. And this one, at least for me, brought them together successfully. And suddenly,
because I think, look, I don't think anyone can accuse this season of any sort of bait and switching. This is truly a season that is about He-Man and Skeletor, and it is about those two characters. Not that it doesn't give room to the supporting characters and side quests and subplots and all of that, but the main dramatic thrust of it is these two guys trying to come to terms with their own sense of identity, right? And as we said, it's Adam trying to understand, do I want to be king? Am I more Adam than He-Man? What is the role of He-Man? What do I owe my people? What do I owe my father? I mean, all that sort of stuff. And Skeletor is really just trying to figure out who he is. And it's not just in terms of trying to untangle his past, but it's also, how does he define himself? And there's this, there's always been this very Shakespearean element to Keldor of being the sort of, I mean, he's like Scar, he's like Loki, he's like he's the looked over prince, his ire being driven by this sense of what he was never allowed to have.
Right. And I love the duel. I love how the little lens from Skeletor turns from, is it green? Yeah, green to red.
Yeah.
And you have that duality, you have those two personalities having dialogue together. When they first announced when they first announced Mark Hamill is going to have dialogue with William Shatner, I never thought it would be
right.
Well, I never thought it would be in their head.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And that's what makes this masterful in retrospect, that here they are playing the same character.
Right.
And it's brilliant. It was brilliant.
Well, because you have the sort of, it takes a while to, for it to become clear what the season is doing with including that character, because you're seeing them occupying different physical forms. Then you sort of understand the degree to which Motherboard is, manipulating the situation. But then you have that sort of fracturing, what Kevin called out as like the Smeagol Gollum thing. Yeah. Of like, well, yes, there's this sort of play acting that is happening for this power grab of presenting Keldor as this new person, but that's sort of bringing to the surface this internal dialogue that Skeletor has been having for a long time with himself. And it's just like, not to be incredibly like simple about it, but it's just like, it's really cool to hear Luke Skywalker and Captain Kirk argue with each other. Yes. It just doesn't get old, and especially with those two guys both really giving their all to those performances.
That's what's so impressive. I mean, I was already impressed with Mark Hamill, and he was nominated for a Daytime Emmy for his performance in Revelation.
And I think his performance is even better this season. Yes. I think you feel him really defining his own Skeletor, That's different than anything he's played, and it's different when Oppenheimer's played, but it has connections to both of those paths.
I don't even hear the Joker anymore.
No,
I just
no, I
hear
agree with that. Yeah,
Skeletor. And it's,
yeah,
yeah, he's found his groove, and I hope he wins a Grammy this year. But then William Shatner.
Emmy, but maybe give him a Grammy too. Maybe Mark
Oh,
Hamill should do an album as Skeletor. Should do Skeletor Comes Alive, and then he can win the Grammy as well.
that's where I'll blame the sinus headache.
Yeah.
Grammy.
Yeah. No,
And
but
a Tony.
he should aspire for a Grammy this season.
Oh man. Okay, so as a voice actor,
Mhm.
with union rules, and you probably know what I'm going to lead up to. You're allowed to do what I believe is 3 voices in a
Yeah.
series.
Yeah. You
And
caught the second one?
oh yeah.
Yeah.
And for everyone who doesn't realize, because I think there's going to be a lot of people who don't know,
Yeah.
and don't necessarily maybe watch the credits at the end to see.
And it's
who's playing.
quick. It's a quick bit. Yeah.
Yeah, which might lend to that additional episode that we were talking about. Maybe I'll do that. So maybe I'll let you reveal it. So Griffin did more than Orko here.
Yeah.
What fan favorite character did you also do?
Tuvar.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And with who?
With Jason Mewes, who is the only other guy. I when the first season came out, Kevin did a weekend of events in New Jersey at his comic book store and at his theater. So I got to spend a whole weekend with Kevin and Jay, which was really great. But so even though I didn't get to record with him, he is a guy who I now, aside from being a fan of his and having watched his stuff for so long, I could record my part of it and kind of imagine what he was doing and imagine the chemistry of it. But that was incredibly cool to do. I mean, first of all, it's like, well, now here's permission for another character to collect, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Thankfully, there's a much more manageable amount of Too Bad merchandise.
Mm-hmm.
It's less of a hit on my bank account than Orko. But it's also cool to get to play a bad guy. It was cool to sort of test out. That was one where Gabe Kuth played Orko on the 2000X version, and then Lou Scheimer, of course, played Orko on the Filmation series. And those were very, very similar voices. So it set up, a sort of precedent of how I think Orko needed to sound in people's sort of mind's ear. And I felt some freedom to be able to try to, carve out my own little space, but you couldn't go somewhere wildly different with Orko. Yeah. Filmation, I want to say, once again, I recorded this almost 2 years ago. So there was a point in time where I knew this like the back of my hand. I want to say his voice is different in a couple of the different Filmation episodes. Because I went back and watched every Too Bad appearance on Filmation, and then I watched the Too Bad episodes on 2000X. And there were very consistent voices, and obviously Too Bad had a much kind of richer arc on 2000X, because you have the sort of origin of them as separate guys before they get cursed together. And then Filmation, I want to say, I don't remember if the actual actor changed or there was just a change in approach to voice, but I remember watching and finding that there were 3 different Tuvar voices across the decades that were all pretty different. So there was a lot of space there to go, like, there's less that you're beholden to. And it's also it's a quick moment. I mean, you talk about the episode getting cut down. I don't think there's any additional dialogue I did that was cut out, but I do think the sort of techno Too Bad appeared a little bit further, at least in physical form, later in the season.
I wish there was going to be a little payoff.
Yeah.
To his creation. At least, when he Battle Armor He-Man is confronting all of the evil warriors. Yeah. We saw instead Webstorm.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
With the technovirus infection. So
yeah,
I was surprised that since he was set up in the beginning in the first episode that there was no payoff. And I was just wondering
my memory is that there was at some point. I mean, once again, this is all a little bit. I've watched the episodes very recently. The scripts and recording were quite a bit ago now. But my memory was, because you do the dialogue, and the dialogue was always just that one scene of them getting dragged in before they're converted. But then you do a lot of miscellaneous fight sounds in character. That's sort of the most fun part of doing voiceover. And with Too Bad, with Tuva, it's a lot of doing the sort of transformation sounds, the possession sounds, all that sort of stuff. But I just think at some point in the script, maybe they came back in some later fight scene.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I would imagine at least was the plan.
Yeah.
And since you're only managing 5 episodes, I figured he just didn't make it to the final.
Yeah.
The final version, and that's why I was thinking just maybe a 6th episode.
Yeah.
But
well, look, I'll say this. I can't say anything further, but I have heard what the full pitch is for the 3rd season, and it is fully figured out. Not that it isn't subject to change, but there is sort of a complete full circle Return of the King notion of what the 3rd chapter would be that I think is so incredibly cool and exciting. And hopefully if people like this new season and it does well, however the Netflix metrics are measured, that will come to be. But there's certainly the intention there.
Can we go there? I mean, we're doing spoilers. We assume they watched. Okay, so what Griffin's talking about is the second credit stinger, right?
Which, by the way, was not in the scripts when I read it. That was a surprise to me when I watched the episode. Everything else was in there. I went back because I watched it and I went, it kind of blew my mind seeing it.
Yeah.
And I went, is it possible that I read this and forgot it? And then I went back and confirmed when I recorded, and obviously Orko's not in the scene. They wouldn't have needed to show me that either way. But when I recorded and they sent me the full scripts, it ended with Evil Lynn and the Cosmic Enforcers with the sort of Zodak moment.
The first credit stinger.
In and of itself pretty exciting. The final beat caught me totally by surprise.
Well, do you remember that middle sequence where you can see, well, anyone who's familiar with She-Ra and the Princess of Power knows it was actually also turned into that animated movie, Secret of the Sword. You see Hordak get away with Adora, baby Adora. He wanted to steal both babies from King Randor and Queen Marlena. Prince Adam stays behind. They capture Skeletor, and he goes out the window with Prince Adora. Was that in the script? Do you recall that flashback when you? That sort of lends itself to that teaser.
My memory is that it wasn't, but I might be wrong about that. After I watched it, I texted Teddy, the executive producer who plays Gildor, and said, I need to interface with you about this, about that ending. And he told me that it was sort of deliberately kept out of the scripts and kept secret for a while. A, because they wanted to keep a lid on it, and B, because there was a bit of a moving target of can we do this? Is this too wild to do?
Yeah.
So my memory is that other moment you're talking about wasn't in there, but I might be wrong about that. And certainly some of those things visually develop organically past the scripting stage once it gets to animation,
When I saw Despera, it blew my mind. And for anyone who doesn't know, who's listening, Mattel owns the character of Despera. That happens to be an evil horde name, alter ego for Adora, i.e. She-Ra. When she's brainwashed and she's working as the Force captain for the evil
And this
horde.
Is from classics. It originates in the sort of classics mythology.
Yeah, it was in the comics too. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
she's in the DC comics, is that correct? So that's around the same time 2010s getting worked in.
Yeah, I think it was the figure first, and then the comics. This was before.
That's my memory as well.
Before the Eternia War comics, she showed up before that, so that was 2014, I think. So, Griffin, have you? And you might not be able to answer this, but have you heard about Mattel and DreamWorks, which for everyone at home is the current television rights holder for She-Ra? DreamWorks. Have you heard of Mattel and DreamWorks finally striking a deal so they could use She-Ra in this Revolution series?
No
comment.
As a big fan,
yes,
and a longtime fan, and one who has gone deeply into the weeds on this stuff, outside of it being kind of shocking as a story development, that is certainly my knowledge of those situations is what made me so surprised to see that in the final scene. The direct question you're asking is so far above my pay grade that I cannot speak to with any authority. But I find what is in that episode very exciting, and I know what the dream is of what would happen in season 3, and I think people would be even more excited to see that happen. And I don't know what has been discussed in boardrooms, what will be discussed, how it will be how it will shake out. I'm not even playing dumb here. There's a lot of it I genuinely don't understand, and it's not for lack of wanting to understand. But I think that scene is very exciting, and I think people can extrapolate wildly from that. And some of their extrapolations might be correct, and some of them might be incorrect. I know also it's already come out. I feel like you reported on it. Another thing, sort of Skelegod style, that I was a little surprised was made public. At the time it was, but there's one of the covers of the new Revolution tie-in comic.
Yes. Who is the Spara? And I'm like, why? It was issue number 4. And I'm like, why?
I don't know how or why that happened. It's certainly a thing I would have thought would be better to have held off for as long as possible. But all this to say, it is fertile story material that everyone involved in this version of MOTU really wants to explore. And there are a lot of thoughts on how to do that, and how it shakes out is to be seen.
Because Griffin, I'm so with you. I was like, there wasn't even a scent of it. By the time that comic came out, I had seen Masters of the Universe Revolution. And I'm like, there isn't even a trace.
No, and you accept it as, I understand this is probably how it needs to be, and there's no other way around it. And, Hordak was announced pretty early. I mean, we've known that Hordak, it has been public knowledge that Hordak was in this series and that Keith David was playing Hordak since last Comic-Con. Whereas, Shatner and Keldor had been a tighter lid on that. So I was so astonished that the lid on the Despara thing was so tight that I was not even aware of it. And you know what? Perhaps they purposefully kept the lid tighter with me because they knew I would I would get it more.
But then to throw it out there on that comic cover, and I realize it's kind of a red herring, because Adora, you have these choices on that comic cover, who is Despara, and none of them are Adora. But still, there wasn't even a trace, a scent.
No, I know.
Everyone would assume that would show up, and now there is. Now people are asking the question: could Despara be in this? And it just boggles the mind. I'm like, why? That wasn't even the cover for issue 1. It was the cover for issue 4.
Once again, I have no idea. I genuinely don't know, but my reaction was exactly the same as yours.
My only guess in my feeble mind would be that there are a lot of She-Ra fans that maybe are not He-Man fans, especially after the latest Netflix series. Some that was their entry into the fandom. And seeing that comic might make them tune in where they otherwise might have not, in hopes that She-Ra will make an appearance.
I mean, I think you only get one opportunity to absorb something for the first time. And, when you're our level of dork who exists online as much as we do, we're used to things getting spoiled by toys leaking out early, or fast food commercials, or all of these things where you're just like, oh, they didn't control this part of the marketing campaign. I think there's the counter side to that too, which is there's certain movies or TV shows where they're being so secretive about everything, and you go, oh my God, what's this amazing secret they're holding from us? And then you watch it and there's nothing that's surprising, but they just are trying to prevent the kind of general leakage that happens. And I think the reality often is there are just so many moving pieces with these things. You have so many different companies that are in conversation with each other that sometimes there's strategies that don't make sense to me, and sometimes I don't even want to say they're oversights, but it's just sort of like the channels of communication don't line up. I have no insight as to what the case was there. But
and it was Mattel who released that cover.
I know. I was surprised by it. Yeah.
You know, it was the same thing we talked about Skelegod. Mattel
Yeah.
did the same thing. And I love Mattel. I love their figures, but they did the same thing with Keldor, where Keldor was part of
the Keldor. They really tried to hold off, though.
Yes, but I guess just the fact that they made it part of that first wave of figures that were coming out in January, and it wasn't even a Keldor figure. It was King Keldor figure. I mean,
once again, I don't have intel here above my pay
know.
grade. I'm speaking purely as a fan.
But Griffin, we were talking about like calling things just Skeletor, not Horde Skeletor. And this figure is
I agree
King
with you.
Keldor.
Technically, the second wave, right? If we're looking at the Masterverse rebrand, because I feel like that first 2024 wave ended up coming out early, but the one that is Skeletech and Sorceress Tila and the new Eternia, Man-at-Arms, and Trapjaw, that came out early. It came out last year instead, but that's sort of, in theory, the first wave of 2024. So they saved King Keldor for second wave, and they had not showed it off anywhere. And even when the recent solicitations went out in pre-orders, they weren't listing King Keldor. And it only came out when people got early samples in hand, and then it was there on the back of the box. Right. And the answer for that is you want people to be... I think when people watch the show, they're immediately going to want to own a Keldor figure. Oh, yeah. You don't want to... have to wait. And I'll say, that's fair. I'm going to be Skelegod. I guess you could argue it's the same logic, but I wish they would have just held it one bit later. The King Keldor figure stayed secret until about 2 weeks ago, when I feel like finally the pictures hit and they weren't released by Mattel. Versus Skelegod, there were like solicitations out for a long time in advance. The figure was on shelves for a month everywhere before the series came out. I will say, I'm going to be as vague about this as possible, but I watched the show as a Masterverse collector, and I'm just going like, oh God, they better make a figure of that. They better make a figure of that. They better make a figure of that. I want all of these, right? We did press for the show a week or two ago at Mattel headquarters, and I got a little tour of Mattel. And a few of the people who work there sort of very quietly and secretly took some things out from under their desk and showed me a lot of the things I hoped were coming. After watching this show, I got to see the early prototypes of. I will not say what any of them are, but in the same way that I watched it and went, well, now I want a King Keldor figure. A lot of the other ones that I felt that way about, I have seen the physical proof that they will be coming at some point. And look pretty amazing.
Yeah.
There are definitely more Revolution figures to come. But I
want to start throwing names at you and watch your face, but I'm not going to do that to you. Yeah. But that's what's great about this fandom is that you get that. It's two components. With these shows being out, you have the shows and then you have the figures, and it's scratching two itches.
Yes. Well, and there were Revolution figures that, out of my bias, I was excited to see the representation. The Revelation figures to me feel like the home team. I'm buying the jersey with my team on it.
Sure.
I love the figures, but it's also like, this is the one I'm a part of. There was other stuff they showed me figure-wise that's similar to hearing that Gildor was going to be on this season, or that Keldor was going to be on this season, where I went, I didn't even consider that you could do that.
Wow.
That Mattel has in the pipeline that I think people are going to lose their minds when they see it.
I better make room back there.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff coming. And I think I only saw a small percentage of it, but it was very cool.
I don't know if you know this, but for like 15 minutes, I was part of the problem. In October, Griffin, I reported an article on FOR ETERNIA.com that I think the article title was Keldor is in Masters of the Universe Revolution.
Yeah.
And that began a whirlwind where, and it's funny because a lot of people reached out to me, including Mattel. And Mattel's like, who is the leak? you know, I need to know, who this leak is. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
it's on Google. It's one of your retailers. It just has it listed. That's how I found out the information. It was like Masterverse Wave 11
But this, to my point, unlike Skelligod, they were trying to hide it.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah.
So I put this out thinking, at the time, for a brief moment, I thought, whoa, this is cool, but I didn't think it was substantial. I never thought it would be William Shatner or substantial to the story. Maybe in a flashback, we learn, oh my God, he's really Keldor,
Well, because it was funny. They announced Shatner and say he's playing an unnamed villain. And then I saw a lot of people jump to assuming Hordak. And then they announced that Keith David's playing Hordak. And I feel like you reported this as well, but there was a story about Mattel renewing copyrights on a couple of different characters, and Granomir came up on that list. So then people assumed, oh, Shatner must be playing Granomir. I really didn't see anyone guess it correctly. I mean, and maybe I'm wrong, but anytime there was any sort of speculation post or video about it, I'd look at all the comments and see, is anyone getting it? And it's such a lateral move. It defies a sort of traditional chain of logic of guessing.
It would never dawn on me. The other one would be Zodak. It would make so much sense.
I saw that one too. Yeah,
because he's in a captain's chair,
right? Right.
And there's so many.
And that Zodak is this sort of neutral character. That he's always been this flexible character in terms of which side he's on.
Yeah, and I can see his voice, suiting that role. So So at the time when I released it, I thought it was exciting. It's exciting when you're breaking news and stuff like that, but I didn't really think, I didn't see the word king. It was just Keldor. It was never King Keldor. And I didn't realize how substantial it was. And then a few people reached out to me other than Mattel wondering, if it was a leak or not, which it wasn't. But, and they were like, look, this is big and this is a big spoiler. And we're trying to keep this lid, sealed. And this could really ruin the experience for people. And I was like, okay, I'm going to pull it down. And I'm not going to mention their names, but I'm going to pull it. So it was up for like 15 minutes. But once I realized like, oh, this is not a flashback. This is something huge.
Yeah.
And I really didn't know how huge it was until I watched Masters of the Universe Revolution. And I'm like, whoa, okay. And it's amazing that they have kept that secret so well. So I should give Mattel credit for that. Yeah, absolutely.
And even other stuff like, I mean, now it's out there on, I mean, by the time this video comes out, the season will be out, but was out on the poster that they put out, the final trailer and everything. But it's not the Green Goddess, I should clarify, but to sort of have this new form of Teela that is in certain ways embracing elements of the Green Goddess and all these sorts of things. They're pulling from so many different. I mean, Granomir. We just kind of brushed over Granomir, but that was to not only have Granomir be in there, but have him be like a cornerstone of the season. It's not like, oh, it's an Easter egg,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was fantastic. And to go back to your sorceress, I was thinking, what is that? The Tri-Sorceress.
Yeah,
she calls herself in show.
Yeah,
and I was looking at her Ka version, and I was looking at her Havoc version, and then her Tri-Sorceress version. I'm like, there's gonna be a lot of figures. We're gonna get a lot of Teela figures.
There's certainly a lot of potential there. Yeah,
and you know what? Those were some awesome looks. And,
incredible looks. But there's, I mean, another perfect example of like Teela's a character that's kind of been clashing with itself since the very beginning. This whole history of, well, are the Sorcerer and Teela two different characters? Are they one figure? Is it a figure that's meant to be played as both characters? Is she green or is she, peach colored? Like all this stuff. Why does she have the snake armor, which is big in the toys and the comics, but isn't really in the cartoons and all this stuff? And I feel like they're pulling all of this into the soup in a really interesting way.
Yeah, I think so too. So the monarchy is gone. And I wonder how fans are going to react to that, because
I do too.
Okay, you do too, because there's that King He-Man precedent in comics and the classics figure and stuff. And this was an interesting choice for me. I mean, I love it.
Yeah.
But I know a lot of people hold on to their lore that they love, and I wonder if they're going to be able to let that go and go, okay, there is no king anymore, and Andra's going to become like a president.
Well, but
you know,
I mean, Andra's going to run for president.
Yeah.
You know, I don't say that to pointedly say that she's not going to become president, but like in the same way, this doesn't negate the possibility of King He-Man entirely. I think you want to like hone in on what it is as a story beat in and of itself, which is, you know, so much of this season is about the responsibility of being a leader, right? Why does Skeletor want to be a leader? Or why do Hordak or Motherboard want to be leading through Skeletor as a vehicle? And what are these feelings of Keldor, who he was before then, and why he felt entitled to this throne that he never got a shot at? And Adam, who doesn't have a choice and maybe isn't sure he wants it, but is being told that this is his birthright, that this is his destiny, and now suddenly this is creeping up closer and faster than he ever expected. I think the big story beat is him just saying, I've been trying to wrestle with the sense of responsibility and whether or not I feel ready for it. And a lot of that is because he is selfless and he does feel a great duty to the people of Eternos, right?
Yeah.
It's not that he is hesitant to become king because he doesn't care. It's real heavy weighs the crown, you know, the anxiety, the pressure of that, the fear of failing to live up to that. And I think the big gesture he makes is not, I refuse to lead these people, because obviously to some degree he's He-Man. He's going to be the protector of these people for as long as he has the power of Grayskull.
Sure.
But the bigger thing is, it shouldn't be my choice to make.
Right.
And a lot of that is, I think, him really considering the kind of tragedy of Keldor. Whether or not that person still exists, whether or not there's like a savable soul in there anymore, that was someone who was largely driven mad by the inability to ever achieve a thing that he wanted, that he felt a right to, you know, what have you. It was never an option to him.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I once again, you look at how the season ends, and the only thing we know for certain is that he wants to abolish the monarchy, which I personally think is a good thing. I believe in democracy in the world. You know, I think it's great to give people a power, and I also think there's certainly civilian characters in MOTU that have existed from the beginning, but there is so much written about the masters of the universe, the people with the power, the people fighting the battles, right? The people at the highest levels of the kingdom, that we don't really tell extended tales about those people. And all of these stories are basically in the name of the masters fighting to protect those people, to support those people, to support the kingdom, all of that. I think there's something very large in a statement of Adam and He-Man deciding, if the show's always about who has the power, you know, that's my read on it. I have no idea how people will interpret it, and it's also, you know, it ends in a pretty open place.
I think it's perfect for this story.
Yeah,
I love it. It's especially important after you see what one person can do when the wrong person's on the throne.
That's really why,
Keldor.
Yeah.
But just in the prism of people being attached to their lore of King He-Man, and they finally can see this realized. That's what I'm just curious how people's reaction. That's why, you know, I did a non-spoiler review. I made sure it was important to mention to try to let all of that go. You know, your pre-existing notions of how things should exist and how things should go in Eternia. You know, even though there is so many different interpretations of the lore, there's not, I don't think, any interpretations of where the monarchy is. You know,
no, I think that's an entirely new concept here. But I also would just say, and I'm not saying this to hint at explicit plans for future seasons that I know of.
Okay.
I'm not being clever about anything concrete here.
Okay.
I'm just saying, as a fan who's invested in the same lore, King He-Man is a character who is much older than the He-Man we have in this series. That has always been something that is pinned off at a far later point in the timeline from when this story is taking place. So I just think, yeah, on its face, that seems to go against that sort of canon, but that's been a sort of side pocket canon that's at a much later point. And by the way, in all tellings, you know, and the King He-Man stuff really comes in, and as you said, the sort of 2010s DC comics and the classics line and everything. It's like the bulk of the story we know is here to here, right? And then there's sort of like King He-Man happening over here, and this space has always been fairly vague.
Yeah.
There's just sort of this pinned future time. So I think, look, they could do 20 seasons and possibly get to a place where King He-Man makes sense, and you see the Adam of that time period sort of growing into that title, or maybe not. But I think the decision of democracy.
Seasons.
Yeah, the decision of democracy at the end of Revolution is so far away from when that would actually happen.
Well, you know what's interesting?
I don't think it closes a door entirely in the same way. But once again, this is entirely my personal reading.
I would love 20 seasons, by the way, but I think Kevin Smith alluded to just 3. And, you know, it was interesting. Kevin Smith said at the 2022 San Diego Comic-Con that we will be able to figure out the name of the 3rd series in this trilogy after we think about it. And now that we've seen Despera, the 3rd series, I gotta think, could be called Masters of the Universe Reunion.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's got that RE in it. You know, you got other words like redemption, which is a good one, right? Rejuvenation, retribution, but I don't know.
If you notice, I chose to cover my mouth while you started listing titles, because I know I know the one they're thinking of right now.
Yeah,
and I will not indicate whether or not any of the ones you just said.
No, please don't. And this is,
up.
and the next thing I'm going to say, this is only me talking and me talking alone. But I personally think that if you go this far and tease this, you're painting yourself in a corner, unless you know ahead of time that if this is a striking success, that you could go ahead and tell this story in the 3rd one. So I got to imagine legally, and this is only AJ saying this, I got to imagine legally, if not, you know, contracts are signed or what have you, that at least they feel pretty confident that DreamWorks will play ball.
I cannot speak to the legality, the contracts, any of that, one iota. Once again, not just because I shouldn't speak to it, but also because the vast majority of it, I have no greater understanding than you. But there's a specific story that I think everyone wants to tell, and a notion of how to tell it. And hopefully all of the many elements will line up to make that happen. People wanting to see it, the right people working on it, what have you.
Yeah, let's hope.
But I don't think... I sometimes... you know, the mid-credit scene has become weirdly something we just expect now. It's funny to think back on the first Iron Man movie, when that was a pretty rare occurrence. There are obviously other cases of that happening, a scene after the credits, a scene in the middle of the credits, but they were...
Griffin, how about Masters of the Universe? I'll be back.
That's true. But that's like an example of, and I'm sure you remember this, but you'd tell people like, hey, how cool's the ending? And they go, what are you talking about? The movie ends with the credits. I left the theater, or I turned off the VHS. It used to be a thing where you'd tell people the thing that happened after the credits and most people had missed it. They didn't know, right? But you're like, yeah, there's these cool kind of promises, and they often were just kind of a little note at the end. And now they've become this sort of an expected thing. I mean, I'm sure you have this experience too, but when you go to see like a big comic book movie or a big sequel opening night, and everyone sits in their chairs just glued as the lights are up, and we're making it through 10 minutes of credits, and then the credits just end with a studio logo and there's no scene, and you audibly hear everyone in the theater go, oh man, why'd I wait for nothing? And you're like, we never used to do this, you know? It used to truly be a thing that would reward the people who happen to stay or who happen to keep their tape running. And all this to say, I think that sometimes I watch movies tack on a scene at the end that is designed to make you go, oh my God, that's crazy. I never expected that happening. But it truly was just people sitting in a room going, what's the craziest thing we could have happen in this scene? Not setting up a specific thing to happen next, right? Yeah. And sometimes they figure out how to write from that point, and sometimes a ball gets dropped or whatever it is. They don't execute it or they forget about it. I feel like we've seen a lot of credit teases that don't amount to anything, or that it's clear they were writing a check for themselves that they didn't know how to cash later. And I there's a very clear, I heard, and I was just thrilled, this sort of broad strokes explanation of what the next season would be. And it was so satisfying to me, and I would like to see it happen. And nothing that happens at the end of this season in any of those final scenes happens wantonly just to sort of have it be a mic drop moment, or have it just to be a thing that people speculate on. It'll be cool if people speculate, but those setups are happening with very clear intent.
I find when those setups happen or setups don't happen, it's kind of cruel, you know? And sometimes it's not due to the producers involved or the actors involved. There just wasn't an audience for the first one.
No, and by the way, I mean, I'm talking about, audiences being disappointed when the end credit scene doesn't happen. I'd rather there be no scene than a scene that feels like it exists just to give you a dopamine hit. Because a lot of times it is just a dopamine hit. Oh my God, I can't believe this character's on screen. They're showing me this new casting. This person's back from the dead. And then you take 4 more steps out of the theater and you go like, well, wait a second, what does that set up? How do they write themselves out of that corner,
It also sometimes takes away from the ending in a way.
I agree strongly. Yeah.
Simpatico with that, because I think I remember I was a big fan of the Daredevil Netflix series. And the third one ended in a terrific manner where all 3 main characters are sitting together. They've made up all their differences, and they're all opening a business and a practice together. And I'm like, this is the last season. What a great scene. And the camera, I think, starts pulling back. But then next we get this stinger at the end of a new villain that never happened.
Of course.
Daredevil season 3 was it. Yeah. And no more. And I'm like,
for now. Yeah.
It's almost like if you were, I'm sure you watched Avengers Infinity War. It was wonderful to end on that last scene where you see Thanos looking into the sunset at a grateful universe, and it ends. And then after the credits, I think it was Nick Fury hitting some sort of pager calling Captain Marvel.
Yes.
And if they would have put that right after that Thanos scene, it would have had a total different effect on the audience.
Yeah.
And would have been counterproductive to the mood you're trying to create.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes it could be just bad decision making. So.
No, I agree. And I mean, to go back to the sort of Adam's call for democracy in this season, it's like, that's the proper ending,
Yes.
Skeletor choosing to identify as Skeletor. This is who I really am. That's my real identity. Like, that's a proper ending. These are the sort of emotional story arcs that are resolved within this season in particular. So it doesn't just feel like it's a string along for, well, when we get to the 3rd season, that's when the real exciting stuff's going to happen. I do think you need to make each episode, each season of whatever you're doing, the most complete story you can tell at that point in time, and then hope that you're lucky enough to get to tell further stories. The tick ended before any of us hoped it would.
Right.
And we had like a couple dangling threads at the end of season 2 that like drive me crazy. They drive me so crazy. And they drive me crazy because I know what was planned and what was intended, but they also drive me crazy because I feel like, and I'm not blaming anyone for this, there were a number of reasons why it happened, but I don't think we figured out the proper way to let that season have its own sense of conclusion. I think the door was a little too wide open. And I look at that final episode and it feels largely unresolved to me in a lot of ways. It feels like it ends with the energy of, well, and then here's what we're going to do next. That doesn't come to pass. And I think there's a good ending point within this season if it had to end. I think I've made it very clear everyone's intention is to do more, and there are really exciting plans for that. And certainly Despara and Tila with the Cosmic Enforcers are like very direct teases for things that could happen next time. But I do think this season works as a pretty complete meal.
Me too. If there was no more, it's a great ending, dissolving the monarchy, and that Tila and He-Man are going to live together in Castle Grayskull.
Yeah.
And you're right. It's a great, and even if they, I don't know with the Zodak ending with Lynn, the Enforcers, I don't even know if people would be, if that was the only stinger, like, oh my God, what's going to happen next?
Yeah.
Just, how so many people are waiting for that reuniting.
Yes.
Despara and He-Man. So that's when it's almost like toying with people's emotions if it doesn't come true. So I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that it does.
Yeah. I don't think anyone's intention was to toy. I think it was to make it clear that everyone working on this show perhaps wants to see the exact same thing that the fans want to see.
And Griffin, I just want to say, I appreciate, your Orko is my favorite. As we're wrapping this up, your Orko is my favorite. It really is. And even though I love Filmation, I was raised on it, and I love Lou Scheimer. How can you not?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But your natural performance without modulation, and then the writing itself,
Yeah. I mean, I really give so much credit to the writing because, as I was saying before, it does make it very easy in a lot of ways. The emotion is sort of right there to tap into. And for a property I care about so much, and for a character I care about so much, just reading the lines out loud gets me emotional because while I'm acting it, I'm also kind of weirdly responding to it the way I would as a viewer, that I would get choked up if I saw Orko doing these things, And so it makes my job incredibly easy, the material they've given, and so many different sides of Orko I've gotten to play just across these 15 episodes so far. I mean, it's like, I feel very spoiled in terms of getting to play like sort of the classic Orko and the weakened withered Orko and the Orko Reborn. And then here with Gildor, he gets to play the kind of snarky snide Orko and all these different variations. But I it's all for me just in, Orko is the character. Lou Scheimer voiced a lot of characters on the show, and that was because, as you were sort of saying before, with union rules, you can have one cast member voice 3 characters before you need to pay them extra.
Yeah.
It's baked into the contract that any voice actor you hire, you can have them also play 2 other characters. And the way Lou Scheimer, who was really savvy as a businessman about keeping his budgets low on his shows, it was how he stayed competitive. One of the ways he did that was they had their main cast of characters, main cast of actors, Oppenheimer and everybody. And then if they had new characters pop up in episodes that exceeded the numbers of how many characters they already had their main cast playing, Lou Scheimer would just take on the other characters under fake names. And his daughter would take on the other characters under fake names.
I think she was underage at some point.
She was. No. I think when she started, she was like 13 or 14.
Something.
But Orko was, it was the biggest character that he played, certainly the most consistent. And it's the biggest character that he created himself, arguably, for Filmation. That was entirely a Filmation creation. And in talking to people who worked on the Filmation show, worked at Mattel and Half for a long time, it was by all accounts a character he felt for very deeply, that he had a real affinity for. Mm-hmm. And I think you can feel that in the performance. And he built a base where, the whole reason I wanted to play him so badly was I felt there was stuff in there that had not been expressed yet. And it's not because of the limitations of anyone's work up until that point. It hadn't been expressed. It was because there wasn't the type of show that gave him this kind of arc yet. Yeah. And I just feel lucky that I'm the guy at the right time, the right place, who was persistent and annoying enough to convince them to let me do it. But I'm so thrilled to, it's weird. I watch the show and I feel like this pride in him that feels very removed from myself, where I'm just like, that's my guy, not like that's me, but I feel like I'm so proud of him holding his own in these battles, and I feel so lucky that I am able to be a small part of a larger team, just kind of keeping the legacy of this character alive.
What's really wonderful is, as a fan, I feel spoiled. And I feel spoiled in a way that I just really appreciate, like you had an org account, a He-Man.org account. Ted Biaselli had a He-Man.org account, that the fans now have grown up and they're continuing the legacy, they're running with the torch. And what we're getting now is as good as it's ever been, in my opinion, maybe better, and it's just so exciting to have that, because there's so many other IPs out there that don't get this amount of love, that we loved as children, and they've sort of fallen by the wayside. But just to have this reinvigorated, and for us to build a community around, because this community is so great.
Yeah, and there were long fallow periods as well. I mean, as I was saying, of like when I first became aware of MOTU and Toy Fair and everything, it was like the only one of these properties I was reading about that was totally on ice. And then even still, it's like, you had classics, and the fandom keeping it alive at a period where there wasn't a lot. And then that leads to classics building to a point where they can work the mini comics in, and then that expands into the DC series, and then both of those things end. And then now we have like really there's almost as much MOTU stuff happening now as there was in the peak in the 80s. Mm-hmm. and so much more in development. And
the movie. Let's hope they tap you for Orko. I mean, you're better at trivia. I'm not going to remember his name. Mm-hmm. Who's the guy who's Optimus Prime that kept
Peter Cullen.
Yes.
I
mean, why couldn't you do Orko for a live action?
I would love to. I would love to, and I think the movie continues to be very much a moving target. Yeah. I think everyone's intent is to get it up and running soon. And I would be thrilled to be part of that in any way possible, but I don't know exactly. Yeah.
All right. So Griffin, I have tortured you enough, my friend.
No, my pleasure.
I really appreciate you having you on, and I really appreciate hearing your perspective, and especially as a fan and as a collector. It's just, it's easy to connect to you, and just makes you a spectacular guest. And so I appreciate you taking your time from your busy schedule to be on today. Now, do you have anything you would like to plug, or anything else you'd like to add or let our audience know that we didn't touch upon?
I'd like to plug Masters of the Universe Revolution, 5 episodes, now streaming on Netflix. I think they're very good. I like watching them a lot. And at tremendous time, I'd like to plug the Orko Gildor 2-pack. In my opinion, end your list now. It's clearly the #1 action figure release of 2024. What's going to beat that? No, my podcast Blank Check with Griffin and David, which you were very kind to call out at the beginning of the show, is about movies, directors, and their careers. And we pick a director and go through all their movies in order. As you said, we did David Fincher recently, and we're shortly going to begin doing John McTiernan, who I think is maybe less recognizable to some people by name, but is one of those guys you didn't realize was had such a massive influence on several genres,
especially in the beginning. Ooh, Die Hard and Predator.
His first movie is Nomads, which almost no one's seen,
with Remington Steele.
Correct,
Pierce
Brosnan.
Yeah,
that's his first movie, and then his next 3 movies in a row are Predator, Die Hard, and The Hunt for Red October, which is kind of as good of a run as anyone's ever had.
Yes.
And Kevin will be appearing on one of those episodes coming up.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I've been reading the site, watching the videos for a long time. I appreciate the support of the show.
So, and you always have an open invitation to come on if you ever want to talk MOTU, any of the other mediums or figures or anything like that.
Hopefully, next time there are episodes coming out, we'll have an excuse to talk again.
That's great.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
All right. So that's a wrap all. We want to thank Griffin for joining us today. You are a delight, sir.
Thank you. Right back at you.
Appreciate that. Especially, I would like to thank our wonderful community out there for listening and watching this podcast. And just a reminder, as Griffin said, you can watch Masters of the Universe Revolution right now exclusively on Netflix. Now, if you enjoyed this show, please show us your support by liking or subscribing to our streams. You can also drop us a line by sending us an email to foreternia@gmail.com. We'd love the feedback. And please visit us at foreternia.com for the latest updates and news. And we have a community forum page, as well as links to our social media pages like X, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram that can help you stay up to date with all of our Masters of the Universe and Masters of the Universe Revolution content. So that's it. Thank you again, Griffin. And I want to thank you all for listening, and let the power return. We'll see you next time. Bye, everyone. Bye, Orko.